Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening, everyone. I never imagined I'd be sharing this story, but I need people to know what happened to my family, especially my oldest son. Sometimes I think that by speaking openly about our experience, I might help other families avoid falling into the same trap, or at least make them pay closer attention to warning signs that we too often prefer to ignore. My name isn't important, and I won't tell you exactly where I live, but I can assure you that everything I'm about to share happened right here in America, on the streets, and in homes where ordinary people go about their daily lives. I've always been a dedicated mother to my two boys, whom I raised practically on my own after separating from their father. My oldest son is named Ethan, and my youngest, Noah. Since they were little, I've tried to be both friend and advisor, balancing affection with discipline. Ethan showed a special interest in physical activity from an early age. Whether it was football, basketball, or track, he was always testing his endurance and pushing his body's limits. Noah, on the other hand, was more drawn to books and art. Despite their differences, we maintained a warm and loving home. When Ethan turned 22, he started working as an outdoor fitness instructor in Portland. He guided groups who wanted to improve their physical conditioning. The sessions usually took place early in the morning, before the sun got too hot, and resumed in the late afternoon when the heat subsided. Everything was going well until he met Vanessa. Initially, I liked her. She was beautiful, quick to smile, spoke sweetly, and didn't appear overly vain. On the contrary, she seemed simple and cordial. At first, I believed Ethan had finally found someone who complimented him well. Vanessa signed up for one of the training groups he led, but it wasn't long before their instructor-student relationship transformed into something more. From their first friendly conversation to the beginning of their relationship, only a few weeks passed. I thought it was a bit fast, but preferred not to interfere since Ethan was an adult. And until then, he hadn't given me reason to worry. He said he felt good around her, and that they had many common interests. Over time, I noticed certain nuances that put me on alert. Despite always being smiling in public, Vanessa had a look that sometimes seemed empty. I can't quite explain it. It was as if she was programmed to act perfectly in front of others, but when she let her guard down, a kind of coldness emerged. I used to comment to Noah, "Son, there's something about Vanessa that doesn't convince me." He would respond that it was just my imagination. After all, she was always offering to help, bringing snacks, and conversing politely with everyone. I decided to keep quiet for fear of sounding paranoid. During this time, Ethan began bringing her to our home more frequently. She would arrive with flowers, cakes, pastries, and call me Mama K, even though my name is Jennifer. Although I always told her not to be so formal, she tried to convince me that she was making Ethan happy and that I could trust her. I confess that on several occasions, her gentle manner fooled me. My son was radiant. He commented that he had never met someone so caring, that Vanessa made a point of joining him for training sessions, even before sunrise. Several months passed, and their relationship evolved too quickly for my taste. Within weeks, they were already talking about marriage. I thought it precipitous, but Ethan told me, "Mom, Vanessa understands me like no one else. She wants to start a family, have stability, and I think this is the right time." I tried to argue that marriage was a serious matter, that perhaps it would be better to wait a bit, but Ethan was certain of his feelings. I realized that arguing would be futile. It gave me a pang of anguish, but I had to accept it. The ceremony was simple, without major preparations, and overnight my house felt empty. Ethan moved into Vanessa's small apartment in the heart of downtown. Noah and I were left alone, missing him at Sunday lunches and our nightly conversations. After the wedding, changes began to emerge rapidly. First, Ethan always seemed in a hurry when he called me. He said everything was fine, but his voice sounded strange, monotonous. He began training less, claiming he was very tired or needed to give attention to his wife. Instead of arriving at the training site before sunrise, he started arriving closer to mid-morning. He missed appointments, was late for personal or professional commitments. I, who had always known him as a focused, disciplined person ready to face any challenge, couldn't understand what was happening. One afternoon, after much insistence on my part, Ethan came to our house without Vanessa. As soon as he arrived, I noticed he had gained some weight, but it wasn't just weight. He seemed bloated, without energy. His eyes looked tired, as if he hadn't slept for days. I tried to make conversation, but he gave short, cold answers and avoided eye contact. "Son, is everything really okay? You're not the Ethan I know." He glanced at me, shaking his head. "It's just a phase, Mom. Vanessa is helping me take care of everything." I didn't want to push further for fear of seeming like I was attacking her. But as soon as he left, I went to talk to Noah. I told him everything I had observed and asked if he too noticed something strange. Noah, who usually didn't get involved in his brother's affairs, admitted that he thought Ethan was different, but preferred not to judge. Still, he agreed that the behavior change was drastic. Time passed, and Ethan distanced himself more and more from me and his brother. He stopped coming to Sunday lunches. The messages we sent went unanswered. When we called, it was Vanessa who answered, with a sweet but decisive voice. "Hi, Mrs. K.A. Pause, as if she forgot my name. He's resting now. You know how work exhausts him." She always seemed to find an excuse not to let Ethan talk to us. This left me increasingly anxious. Then, in an act of desperation, I decided to go to their apartment without warning. I knocked on the door and waited. Vanessa answered with a smile that gave me chills. Ethan appeared in the background, but didn't come to hug me or show any happiness at seeing me. He stood still, as if waiting for her permission to speak. She invited me in, but I could feel it was just a show of appearance, because I saw no real hospitality in her gestures. Ethan barely talked to me that day, responding only with monosyllables. Vanessa kept saying, "You know, he's so committed to his classes, but I worry about the women who approach him. I can't stand seeing him surrounded by people at work." I tried to explain that it was his job, that this interaction was normal. She smiled, saying, "I know, but these days we can't trust anyone, can we?" When I left, I felt an indescribable anguish. It was as if that apartment was charged with a bad, dense energy. Ethan wasn't the same. Something seemed to be sucking away his joy and his essence. Even without concrete evidence, I had the feeling that Vanessa was behind it all. The following week, I shared my fears with a dear neighbor, Mrs. Wilson. She was a woman in her late 60s, known for the folk remedies she prepared to open paths, ward off envy, and things like that. I told her without excessive details that my son had been acting strange since the marriage, that my daughter-in-law was very controlling, and that I feared something deeper. Have you ever thought about something, spiritual, Mrs. Wilson asked straightforwardly. I confess my heart raced. At that moment, I was still oscillating between seeking psychological help for Ethan or considering something less explainable. I wasn't ready to say witchcraft or any similar word, but it seemed almost inevitable. I don't know, Mrs. Wilson. Maybe he's just in an abusive relationship, but there's something very strong. He doesn't seem to react. I can't explain it. She sighed and placed her hand over mine. This could be a type of binding, my dear. Many people use these things to hold on to their partner. I got goosebumps from head to toe. The idea of a binding spell seemed so distant from our reality. But at the same time, with each detail I remembered of Ethan's behavior, everything indicated that it wasn't just a personality change. I decided, before any conclusion, to seek a doctor to rule out something physical or purely psychological. But Ethan refused to go. When I told Noah, he was also shocked. In his eyes, I saw that he finally believed me. He even commented, "Mom, since she appeared, Ethan has no more light. He always seems apathetic." Given this, I decided I needed help. I spoke again with Mrs. Wilson, and she referred me to an acquaintance who worked as a healer. Her name was Rose, but everyone simply called her Mama Rose. Mrs. Wilson said that Mama Rose had helped other people in similar situations, although she never went into details about these cases. I went to her house without telling Ethan, of course. Noah came with me for support. Upon arriving at Mama Rose's place, we found a simple environment, yet full of elements that to me conveyed a certain calm. There were cloths hanging in the yard, herbs drying in the sun, and a strong smell of rue mixed with other plants I couldn't identify. She greeted us with a welcoming smile and asked us to sit on a porch covered by old shingles. Before we began talking, she brought a jug of fruit juice and aluminum cups, asking us to make ourselves comfortable. Then I asked if Mrs. Wilson had already spoken about my situation. Mama Rose confirmed with a nod. I began to tell the whole story: Ethan's behavior, the lightning-fast marriage, Vanessa's obsession with controlling his every step, and especially the feeling that something supernatural hung over us. Mama Rose listened in silence, staring at me with serene but penetrating eyes. When I finished, she sighed. "My child, it's not the first time I've heard reports like this. Not everything is witchcraft, but there are cases where some resources are used to bind a person emotionally, leaving them without their own will. Have you noticed any dietary changes, any new habits, like teas or different foods that he started to consume?" I paused to think and remembered that on the few occasions when Vanessa appeared at my house before the wedding, she brought ready-made foods or green juices that she said were very healthy, made with special herbs and leaves. I even commented at the time that the flavor was strong and strange, but I didn't give it importance. I told this to Mama Rose, who thoughtfully scratched her chin. It could be that these preparations have an intention beyond flavor. There are many recipes that promise to bind a person through the stomach, so to speak. Noah intervened. But does this really work? Mama Rose gave a calm smile. I can't affirm what she does or doesn't do. But if the person preparing has more intentions, and if the other is vulnerable, some energies can indeed influence behavior. It's not a miracle, but it can cause a state of dependency. She asked me if I had any personal object of Ethan's that I could bring. Unfortunately, I had nothing except some old photos of him exercising. But Mama Rose said it would serve just for her to feel the energy and concentrate. She lit a white candle before a small religious image and asked Noah and me to remain silent. She closed her eyes and slowly passed her hands over the photos, as if reading something in the air. I can't explain what happened at that moment, but I felt a chill. The breeze seemed to have gotten colder, and my arms got goosebumps. After a few minutes, she opened her eyes and spoke in a low voice. The young man is indeed under strong influence. I don't know if it's a spell or just psychological manipulation, but he needs to get away from that environment to regain clarity. Can you bring him to your house for a few days without her around? I laughed nervously because I had no idea how to convince Ethan to stay away from Vanessa. He was so dominated that if he did something without her approval, he was likely to have a crisis. Mama Rose, however, insisted, "If you want to save him, it will be necessary. I'll give you an herbal bath for him to take and some guidelines. But if he continues to consume whatever this woman gives him, it will all be in vain." It was scary to hear that, but I was determined not to lose my son. I thanked Mama Rose and returned home trying to devise a plan. Noah offered to talk to Ethan. Fortunately, the two always had a good relationship, and I thought perhaps Ethan would feel less pressured by a younger brother than by his own mother. So Noah called him that same night, insisting that he spend the weekend at our house. Surprisingly, Ethan accepted, saying he indeed needed to talk to us about something important. When I told Noah about the herbal bath and the rituals that Mama Rose had suggested, he reacted with caution. I hope Ethan doesn't find it strange. Let's try to do this without him realizing it's a counterspell. I agreed, already anticipating that I would need to be very careful in my approach. We prepared Ethan's room and bought some ingredients that Mama Rose had indicated to make a kind of tea that we should mix into his food. It was nothing beyond plants, nothing that would harm him, but supposedly it would help purify and break the negative influence. On the appointed day, Ethan arrived at our house with a small suitcase and a closed expression. Vanessa didn't accompany him, but she called insistently. Whenever his phone rang, I noticed that Ethan became tense. During dinner, I talked about trivial matters, avoiding any direct confrontation. He finally announced what he had to say. "Vanessa and I are expecting a child." I was speechless. My blood froze. I, who already harbored so much distrust of her, couldn't pretend to be happy. Noah tried to feign excitement, but Ethan, very observant, noticed that we didn't react the way he expected. "You're not happy." I thought with the pregnancy, the whole family would unite. I swallowed hard and responded as gently as I could. Son, of course I'm surprised. It's a lot of news to digest. You know, I've always wanted to be a grandmother, but you guys moved fast with everything, didn't you? He didn't retort, just sat silently looking at his plate. Later, when Ethan went to take a shower, I took the opportunity to put a few drops of the infusion in the juice he would drink. I did this with a heavy heart, as I didn't want to deceive him. However, the idea of losing him to that woman made me follow Mama Rose's guidelines without hesitation. That night, I didn't notice any immediate difference. He slept in his old room, locked the door, and only spoke to me the next morning, seeming tired but less agitated. I spent the day cooking foods he liked, mixing the herbal infusion whenever possible. I also remembered to light candles at the time Mama Rose had determined, mentally asking that Ethan be freed from any bonds. Meanwhile, he maintained contact with Vanessa by phone, but I noticed that he gradually reduced the calls. From hour to hour, it turned into 2 or 3 times a day. I don't know if it was the effect of the herbs, or just the cozy atmosphere of the house where he grew up, but something was changing in him. On the 3rd night, Ethan brought up the subject of the baby again. Mom, I need your honest opinion. Do you think I'm not ready to be a father? I finally found an opening to address the issue. I told him that I saw him exhausted, with a countenance that wasn't his. I said I felt as if he wasn't acting of his own volition. He lowered his head, agreed in silence, but didn't want to go into details. He only commented, "Sometimes I have the feeling that I got married without thinking properly. She's a good person, but I can't stay away from her even when I want to." That was enough for me to confirm that we were on the right track. What was still missing was the courage for him to admit that something in that relationship bothered him too much. Noah, sensing the opportunity, suggested that Ethan stay at least a few more days with us, using the excuse of dedicating himself to a professional project. My oldest son agreed, which would have been unthinkable before. Vanessa apparently didn't like it, as she called frequently and interrogated him. "What time are you coming back? Who's there with you? Are you really working, or are you with someone else?" He sighed, annoyed, saying he needed space. Each phone call ended in an argument that left him with a frown. By the end of the first week with us, I noticed clear improvements. He was already able to go for runs early in the morning, resuming a bit of his old exercise routine. He seemed to breathe better. He even talked about returning to some training sessions he had set aside because of his husbandly duties. However, a call from Vanessa was enough to change his mood, as if he were swallowed by a heavy cloud. Still, it was a notable advance compared to the apathetic state in which he had arrived. In parallel, I returned to Mama Rose's house to report the progress. I brought a shirt that Ethan had worn during his workouts, and she performed the energization ritual again. She told me she saw positive signs, but that everything was still fragile. If he returned to living under the same roof with his manipulative wife, the spell or psychological influence could fall back on him. It was essential to strengthen his will. She gave me a small ribbon made of braided red fabric, guiding me to give it to Ethan, explaining that it was for protection. She asked that he tie it on his wrist and not remove it for anything until he felt completely free. When I returned, Ethan didn't object to wearing the ribbon, although he made some comments that it all might be superstition. I didn't disparage his opinion, as it was a big step to know that he accepted help, albeit with reservations. At one point, he even asked me, "Mom, do you really believe that Vanessa might be doing something against me?" I was silent for a moment. Then I said, "I believe that there are energies we don't understand well, and I do believe that you are being influenced in a way that isn't natural. I don't know if she does it out of malice or if it's just an obsession, but I fear you will suffer greatly if you continue like this." He didn't insist on the subject, but I realized he was thinking about it. At this point, Vanessa, who still claimed to be pregnant, began sending messages to me as well. She wanted to know what I was doing with her husband, why he wasn't returning soon, if I was manipulating Ethan against her. In some messages, she suggested that I was robbing his freedom, which was ironic since she had been restricting Ethan since the beginning of the marriage. I tried to stay calm and responded politely that Ethan was fine, but needed time to organize his thoughts. She eventually lost patience and threatened me, saying she wouldn't stand idly by. I was afraid, but I didn't let Ethan know because I didn't want to disturb him. Finally, he decided that he needed to meet Vanessa in person to talk. He said he was tired of the situation and wanted to clarify everything, especially regarding the pregnancy. Noah and I feared she would entangle him again with the same control as before. I tried to dissuade him, but Ethan was firm. "I have to face her, Mom. I can't live in this eternal flight. I need to understand what's really happening." He went to her apartment one late afternoon. He returned a few hours later, seeming upset. He sat on the sofa, drank a glass of water, and remained silent for a few minutes. I tried not to pressure him, but curiosity was eating me up. It was then that Ethan looked at me with a tense face and told me, "She said I'm being selfish, that I abandoned my pregnant wife, but when I asked to see the tests, I verified that the dates don't match. It seems she was already pregnant even before we got married." "And what did she say about that?" I asked, shocked. She evaded the question, said she didn't owe me explanations, but something tells me this baby isn't mine. That was a shock. At the same time, it sparked a flash of indignation in Ethan. He, who until then had been submissive, began to react. He asked Vanessa for a paternity test, but she refused to talk more about the subject. She shouted, hurled insults, and he ended up leaving to avoid prolonging the argument. That night, I realized that my son had finally opened his eyes to reality. He was still shaken, but showed signs that for the first time, he understood how destructive that relationship had been. In the following days, the situation unfolded turbulently. Ethan decided to put an end to it and announced that he would formally request a separation. Vanessa's reaction was devastating. She made a scene. She threatened to take everything from him, accused him of abandonment, said she would seek justice to demand alimony. Noah and I tried to support him emotionally, reminding him that if there was no true bond of love or respect, it was better to interrupt this cycle. Ethan also began to suspect that the pregnancy might be a way to bind him, but he was already resolute to discover the truth. A few days later, he managed to schedule a medical consultation, which Vanessa reluctantly agreed to attend. There were suspicions about the time of gestation and paternity. Without going into unnecessary details, the doctor requested tests and advised them to seek counseling, as the atmosphere was very tense. As soon as they left the clinic, Ethan returned to my house more downcast than ever. He said that Vanessa had practically confirmed that she had maintained another relationship before marrying him, although she didn't clearly admit it. I turned to him. "Do you really want to continue with this?" He shook his head, showing for the first time a sense of relief in his eyes. "No, I've made the decision. I want my freedom back." Amidst all this storm, Ethan resumed his training activities. He started waking up early to run, gradually recovering his physique. The red cord on his wrist remained there, and he no longer questioned its function. He began to eat only what we prepared at home, avoiding anything Vanessa might give him. I noticed that he was more lucid, less apathetic, almost returning to his normal state. He was still afraid of facing possible legal consequences, but he was determined not to yield. It was then that he decided to confirm on his own the suspicions about paternity. He spoke with a friend who worked in a clinical analysis laboratory and discovered that there was a possibility of doing a preliminary test using small biological samples, as long as he could get something from her without alarm. It wasn't easy, but in a final meeting to collect his belongings from Vanessa's apartment, Ethan managed to discreetly save a piece of napkin she had used and some material that could be tested. It wasn't the ideal way, but desperation led him to this. Finally, the result of this unofficial test came out, showing a very high incompatibility with Ethan's DNA. Although it wasn't 100% conclusive, like an official exam, it strongly indicated that he wasn't the father. This was enough for my son to feel that the last link that bound him to her was breaking. I felt sorry for him, as I saw in his eyes a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief at knowing he wouldn't need to maintain ties with Vanessa forever. Sadness at having been deceived. From this point on, the path to divorce became inevitable. Ethan began sleeping every night at home, and Vanessa practically disappeared. Although for a few weeks, she tried to call me or send messages threatening to get even and questioning if the test was valid. When she realized it wasn't having an effect, she disappeared completely. I imagined she might prepare something more sinister, but I believe that upon feeling she had lost control over Ethan, she preferred to retreat. As the days passed, Ethan rediscovered himself. He bought nutrition books, returned to teaching with the vigor of before, and even gained new students because people noticed he had a different energy. That pallor that dominated him gave way to a radiant countenance. Sometimes he felt guilty for having taken so long to notice the signs that Vanessa wasn't the ideal person, but I consoled him. "Son, you were manipulated. The important thing is that you managed to get out of it in time." In the following months, the routine was established more peacefully. Ethan initiated the divorce, using a lawyer recommended by a friend. Noah, proud, said that his brother was finally being reborn, both emotionally and professionally. And indeed, I saw a strong man who had learned a lot through pain, but who had become more mature. The red ribbon eventually broke naturally after some time, and Ethan didn't even think of replacing it. It was as if symbolically he was free from all that. Given so many events, we became closer as a family. Ethan made a point of participating in Sunday lunches. He was always present, helped Noah with advice on physical activity, and encouraged his brother to exercise more. I saw the two of them running in the park or playing ball, and remembered the times when they were just boys. That filled my heart with gratitude, as I had feared that Ethan would sink completely. It was around this time that I almost accidentally met a young woman named Lauren, who worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center. She was a colleague of a friend of Ethan's, and by coincidence, ended up getting closer to him as they accompanied the same patient during exercise sessions and postural re-education. The two discovered common interests, began to talk outside the professional environment, and little by little, a sincere friendship took shape. Already vaccinated against precipitous passions, Ethan preferred to go slowly. It was months of friendly coexistence before they assumed a relationship. The first time I saw Lauren, I noticed a striking difference in relation to Vanessa. While the latter showed herself to be gentle in a somewhat theatrical way, Lauren was naturally delicate, calm, didn't seek to be the center of attention. She talked about her studies, liked to exchange ideas about books and health research, and showed no jealousy or need to approve every step of Ethan. He himself confided one day, "It's strange how I feel light with her, Mom. I don't need to worry about what I'm going to say or do." I nodded, giving a smile, as I knew he was finally experiencing a healthy relationship. The news of Ethan's divorce came without legal complications. Vanessa's pregnancy continued without any participation from my son, and nothing more was heard about it after she moved to another neighborhood. One could say that episode came to an end, although deep marks remained in all of us. If before I hesitated to believe in spiritual influences or witchcraft, now I was sure that at the very least, greater forces can be at play when there is manipulation of food, drink, or even thought. I began to talk with Noah about what we had learned. We spoke of the importance of not ignoring subtle signs, of not allowing someone to remove the brightness and will to live from another person. We also learned that the intervention of a dedicated family can save someone from sinking completely into an abyss. Of course, each case is different, but in ours, it was crucial not to give up on Ethan, even when he seemed unreachable. Today, I look at my oldest son and see a reborn man. He continues living with me temporarily, but he's already looking at apartments to restart a new stage alongside Lauren, who certainly doesn't suffocate him or drive him away from us. It's a new day, a new scenario. And when I think of Vanessa, I think that perhaps she was just a disturbed person using strange resources to keep Ethan with her. Be that as it may, no one has the right to nullify another in this way. I am at peace knowing that at least she is no longer part of our lives. In the end, everything we went through serves as a lesson. I learned, for example, to trust my intuition more. From the beginning, something told me that Vanessa wasn't who she appeared to be. I should have been firmer on the occasion, but it's difficult to go against the will of an adult son. Still, our love as mother, as brother, and the courage to seek help were stronger than any manipulation. And Ethan, in turn, today understands the value of personal freedom and conscious choice. "Mom," he told me the other day, "I swore to myself that I will never again let someone decide for me." Finally, I want to leave a message to whoever reads this story. Evil can present itself in subtle forms, masked as gentleness and excessive care. But when something is wrong, the signs appear. We just need to be attentive, because true love doesn't nullify, doesn't imprison, and much less steals the essence of a person. Be it psychological manipulation, a possible spell, or any other kind of control, it's necessary to act quickly to free whoever is in the web. I hope from the bottom of my heart that other families never need to go through what we went through to understand this. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive the upcoming stories. Your presence is important, and your support is essential. Well, let's go. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I always told myself that stories of curses and witchcraft were merely inventions of impressionable minds. I never imagined something like this could cross my path. I grew up in a small coastal town in Maine, one of those places that tourists drive through without stopping, where locals whispered about strange lights over the water and figures that appeared in the distance during the early hours of the morning. Such rumors circulated primarily during family gatherings, but I never paid much attention. I thought it was all exaggeration, or the product of creative minds fueled by isolation and too many long winters. Life was uneventful. I spent my days skateboarding down the boardwalk, exploring the rocky shoreline, helping my grandparents at their antique shop, and had no greater ambitions than enjoying my teenage years without worry. When I turned 16, my parents moved to Arizona for work and left me living with my grandparents since there wasn't enough money to relocate all of us. I didn't complain. I enjoyed their company. My grandmother was deeply religious, always lighting candles, praying, and blessing any scratch I might get with her special herbal salves. My grandfather, on the other hand, was more reserved. He believed in certain stories, but spoke little of them. He maintained that if you didn't mess with the unknown wouldn't mess with you. As time passed, I discovered my weakness was conquest. By 17, I became interested in various girls from town and neighboring communities. I enjoyed the game of flirtation, that sensation of danger and adrenaline when trying to charm someone at beach parties or community events. The elders in such a small town full of gossip looked sideways and commented that I acted irresponsibly. Many said I would soon get myself into trouble, as word traveled quickly throughout the area. I laughed, thinking I had complete control over my world. At 18, I met Amber, a girl with a kind and helpful disposition. She welcomed me into her life with open arms, and her family treated me well. In the first few months, I started a serious relationship with her, but continued getting involved with other girls. Amber discovered some of my infidelities and was devastated. There was a time when she showed up at my house crying and saying she couldn't take it anymore. I promised I would change, but honestly, I didn't. That was just to calm her down. She was important to me, but I didn't want to give up the fun I was having elsewhere. "Please don't do this," Amber would say, wiping tears with her sleeve. "I promise it won't happen again, babe," I would respond, already thinking about my next adventure. During that same period, I met a girl named Olivia who lived in the next town over. We exchanged secret messages and saw each other when I made up excuses for Amber. I lived in this constant charade, manipulating both of them. Some acquaintances in town whispered that I was asking to be discovered. After all, rumors flew there. I found it amusing, convinced that nothing would ever affect me. That's when Morgan entered my life. I met her during a summer festival, and I immediately noticed she had a more mysterious air about her. Shortly after we started talking, I asked basic questions, but she deflected, smiling enigmatically. Nevertheless, I remained interested. There was something about her that intrigued me. Morgan seemed to know all the legends and ghost stories of the town. She spoke of shadows that appeared behind those who cheated, of whispers at dawn that announced some impending tragedy. They said she was from somewhere else, that she had lived for some time with a relative who practiced folk healing and charms. Some called the woman a witch and said that Morgan had learned various rituals from her. I pretended not to care, but I was slightly curious to know where all this knowledge came from. One day, I casually mentioned to my grandmother that I had been seeing Morgan, and her expression changed immediately. Her face grew concerned, but she didn't directly say anything against her. The only thing she advised was, "Be careful, grandson. Sometimes we mess with things that seem harmless but aren't." I brushed it off. After all, to me, Morgan didn't seem dangerous, just more reserved and the keeper of frightening stories. I thought my grandmother had heard some malicious rumor, or was simply cautious by nature. Months passed, and I lived a double or triple life, if you count casual flirtations. Amber in one corner, Olivia in another, and my confidential conversations with Morgan, even though we never established a firm relationship. I wasn't ashamed of anything. On the contrary, I prided myself on my ability to juggle it all. My grades in school weren't bad. My grandfather didn't pressure me much, and I thought I controlled my own destiny. But this whole theater began to crumble when, one afternoon, Amber came looking for me and found evidence that I was involved with Olivia. And they weren't just suspicions. She saw compromising messages on my phone. Amber was desperate. I tried to smooth things over with lies. "You're overreacting. Olivia is just a friend," I would say. "A friend? Then why do you say such intimate things to her?" Amber questioned, breathless, until I got irritated and told her to stop being annoying. She cried but stayed. She insisted that she loved me and didn't want to break up. But subtly, I noticed that sweetness was transforming into silent resentment. During the same period, Morgan invited me to visit her house. She said she had something to show me, something that could, according to her, change the way I understood life. Curiosity spoke louder, so I agreed. I drove to a more isolated place without telling anyone. It was early evening when I arrived. The house was located near an abandoned lighthouse. The gate was rusty metal, and there was a smell of damp earth in the air, though it hadn't rained for days. Morgan greeted me with a subtle smile. "Come in, I'll make some tea," she invited. The house inside had minimal furniture. There was a long corridor, at the end of which I saw a partially open room from which emanated a dim glow of candlelight. The environment seemed frozen in time, as if no one actually lived there. Morgan led me to a small living room, where she served me a bitter tea. I swallowed with some suspicion, but didn't want to appear rude. "I want you to see something I do in my spare time," she said, pointing to the corridor. "What?" I asked. "My studies of energies and transitions, things many would call witchcraft. I don't like using that term, but it's the closest description." I confess I widened my eyes, but tried to maintain the posture of someone not easily frightened. We walked to the room at the end of the corridor. Upon entering, I noticed a heavy scent of incense and burnt herbs. There was a small improvised altar with jars and bottles of various sizes, as well as stone figures and candles in metal holders. The wind entered through a poorly sealed window, making the flames dance. "You're joking, right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No, here I practice rituals for protection, cleansing, and also to resolve emotional issues," Morgan explained. She stared at me with such a fixed gaze that for a moment I felt slight discomfort, as if my throat tightened. I wondered if it was the effect of the tea or simple nervousness. She approached, placed her hand on my shoulder, and said, "You're full of contradictions, aren't you? You seem to carry a huge burden of secrets. Be careful not to spread heartache around. Heartache can return in unexpected ways." I pretended not to care, but I felt a chill. It wasn't common for someone to talk to me like that. As a defense reaction, I gave a short laugh and looked back at the altar. People had told me Morgan was strange, but I was there with my inflated ego, believing everything would end well. At the end of that night, nothing unusual happened. I said goodbye with a quick hug, and she murmured something I didn't quite understand, something about returning to the source. I got in the car and left with the feeling that the whole situation, as eccentric as it seemed, wouldn't affect me. I continued with my life normally, not noticing that something might have been forming for some time, as if it were gathering strength. Shortly after, I began to feel feverish during the mornings, a discomfort that came and went, accompanied by an uncomfortable anguish. I attributed it to a virus, but at night the symptoms worsened, and I started having disturbing dreams. In each one, I saw a female figure staring at me from a distance. I would wake up sweating, but told myself it was just fatigue. Amber noticed my paleness and insisted I see a doctor. I went to a clinic, and the initial diagnosis was something like stress or poor diet. I tried vitamins, but I didn't improve. To make matters worse, I began having recurrent nightmares. I saw shadows, and sometimes I heard a voice calling my name. One night when Amber slept next to me, I woke up startled in a cold sweat, with my heart racing. She hugged me, asking if I was okay. I nodded, but avoided sharing details. I had dreamed that an icy hand touched my face, and when I turned, I saw only an empty room. That began to shake me. As a consequence, I stopped responding to Olivia's messages. I had no energy for seduction games. Amber was happy with my apparent change, but noticed me becoming increasingly withdrawn. At one point, I ran into Morgan on the street. She asked if I felt strange, or if something had been bothering me. I had the urge to demand answers, but hesitated. I felt a fear difficult to explain. That woman, once so attractive, now caused me discomfort. She touched my arm and said, "Sometimes certain people pay for what they do, but there are ways to fix it." Her words sounded like a veiled threat. I moved away with excuses and returned home trembling. I reported what happened to my grandfather, who scratched his chin and muttered, "This might be serious trouble, son. Better talk to your grandmother." My grandmother listened to me attentively, then asked me to see a woman she called a faith healer, someone with a reputation for curing evil eyes and negative energies. Although I thought it all folklore, I was desperate to return to who I was before. Without hesitation, I went with my grandmother to a modest house on a dirt path. The owner of the house, whom they called Ms. Sarah, received us on the porch. She had a serious but welcoming countenance. She made me sit on a wooden stool and passed herb branches over my body, reciting low prayers that I didn't understand. Then she broke an egg into a glass with water. I observed with surprise when I noticed that the egg white twisted in dark lines, as if it were dirty. "You have something attached to you," said Ms. Sarah, frowning. "What do you mean?" I asked anxiously. "Someone cast negative energy on you. It could be out of jealousy or resentment. Maybe both. Have you been breaking hearts around here?" she questioned incisively. My grandmother gave me a disapproving look. I swallowed hard but nodded, thinking of the betrayals I had committed. It was absurd to think this could generate a curse, but just in case, I was willing to do anything to rid myself of that torment. Ms. Sarah prescribed herbal baths, prayers upon waking, and an amulet made of fabric that she asked me to carry in my left pocket every day. She also advised, "Avoid the person who brought you this evil. They can strengthen the bond if they notice you're still weak." I left there with a mixture of relief and disbelief, but I clung to the hope that these rituals would work. I started the nightly baths with the herbs that exhaled a strong aroma of rue and basil. However, the headaches and fevers persisted. Worse, I began to hear creaking in the house during the early hours, as if something were passing through the corridors. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched increased. Amber tried to help me, but upon discovering a trace of a message from Olivia on my phone, she lost patience. Although I was no longer seeing Olivia, that old message was enough for Amber to decide to distance herself. It was a hard blow. The relationship that kept me minimally stable dissolved. Suddenly, I found myself alone in my grandparents' house, dealing with almost daily nightmares. A week later, my grandmother woke me in the morning and said she had received a strange visit. A pale-faced woman had knocked on our door, asking to speak with me, but hadn't given her name. When my grandmother went to invite her in, the woman disappeared. Our gate was still locked. That made my grandmother panic, thinking it was a bad omen. I inside could only think of Morgan, though it was impossible for her to have vanished like a ghost. We decided to consult another specialist, this time a man known for dealing with more severe cases of work done. His name was Elijah. He lived near an old mill and was usually sought when conventional prayer failed. I went there with my grandmother. The place was simple, but had various objects hanging from the ceiling and on the doors, such as bells, small mirrors, and colored ribbons. Elijah received me with a penetrating look. He asked questions about my life, if I kept many secrets, if I had deeply hurt someone. I couldn't lie. I confessed my various betrayals. I mentioned the suspicions about Morgan. He nodded seriously. Someone is messing with forces that can torment the mind and body. he stated, lighting a candle on the floor. He asked me to kneel while he passed incense around. The smell filled my nostrils, bringing more nausea. Then he performed a strong prayer, repeating my name and saying, "Let the evil return to its origin. Let this bond be broken." At that moment, an enormous dizziness knocked me down, and I leaned on my grandmother's arm. I felt such intense chills that my teeth chattered. Elijah instructed me to resist, not to run away or interrupt the prayer. They were agonizing minutes. When it was over, I was drenched in sweat. He looked at me and said, "I can't promise immediate healing. You must have faith and follow my advice." I left there with some recommendations. Always have a bouquet of herbs inside the house. Pray aloud before sleeping, and not respond to provocations from anyone involved in the dark arts. For a few days, I felt a slight improvement. I even managed to eat without feeling sick. But at night, reality knocked me down again with the impression that there was a figure watching me in the yard. To not frighten my grandparents, I began to close my bedroom door and pray quietly. One afternoon, while I was trying to rest, my grandmother entered the room, pale. She showed me a package that had been left on the porch, a handful of dark soil wrapped in red fabric with a string tied around it. Inside there was also a lock of hair that appeared to be mine. I felt a chill down my spine. How did they get my hair? Had it been from an old haircut, or had someone taken it from a comb? This suggested that the person responsible for the spell had access to something personal of mine. "Throw this away," I asked with a trembling voice. "I'll take it to Elijah to burn." "It's dangerous to keep it here," my grandmother responded. I was overtaken by a palpable despair. I needed to take action, but didn't know which one. I thought about confronting Morgan, but I remembered the warning from Ms. Sarah and Elijah. That could make everything worse. Suddenly, I understood that I wasn't in a simple game of seduction. I felt cornered, watched by something I couldn't directly combat. The nights became a greater torment when I began to hear my name in a low voice in the corridor. I would get up, open the door, but only find darkness and my grandmother sleeping in the other room. Sometimes a shadow would move on the wall, but there was nothing there among the furniture. I tried to convince myself they were hallucinations caused by anxiety. But my heartbeat accelerated so much that I thought I would have a heart attack. At a certain point, Amber, who had distanced herself from me, called to see if my health had improved. I told her I wasn't well, but I didn't mention anything about magic or curses. She wished me well and hung up coldly. I felt the weight of my choices and the growing loneliness. Deep down, I deserved the consequences, but I never imagined they would be so intense. What perplexed me was the frequency with which small, unpleasant things happened. Light bulbs burned out without reason, doors slammed by themselves, utensils fell from the table when I was nearby. I went to the doctor again. He said my immune system was weak and suggested psychological counseling. Still, no medicine resolved the migraines and dizziness. In an attempt to distract myself, I decided to visit a friend in the neighboring town. But during the bus trip, I had the impression of seeing Morgan sitting in the back, observing me. I turned to face her, but the place was empty. I arrived at my destination, even more shaken. I spent the night there, and had a nightmare in which something scratched my chest. Upon waking, I noticed a slight red mark on my skin. I attributed it to a possible involuntary scratch while sleeping, but it was still frightening. My friend found my haggard appearance and silence strange, but didn't delve into questions. I returned the next day to my grandparents' house, who received me with concern. My grandmother said that while I was away, she heard loud knocks on my bedroom window. When she went to check, there was no one. Even with the gate locked, someone or something seemed to approach. Desperate, I sought Ms. Sarah again. She performed another ritual, this time using a white handkerchief that she rubbed on my wrists and neck, reciting prayers. Then she buried the handkerchief in the yard, saying it would absorb part of the negativity. I stood still, watching, not knowing whether I believed it or not. Afterward, she insisted that I change my way of acting in life, as all the resentment I had spread in past relationships opened gaps for attacks. But how to change? I asked, frustrated. First, stop deceiving people. Second, avoid contact with whoever did this to you. Third, maintain faith. I nodded, feeling like a failure. The old confidence I had was gone. I tried to follow the guidelines, but it seemed each step was futile. The nights remained turbulent, and with each nap, I woke up with a terrible feeling. At a certain point, I began to distrust any noise, any whisper of the wind. My grandparents prayed with me, but the house continued to feel heavy. I thought about moving away, maybe going after my parents and starting over far away. But I was afraid that this shadow would follow me wherever I went. While deciding, I received a message from an unknown number. The text simply said, "Do you think you can escape?" I almost dropped the phone from my hands. I showed it to my grandmother, who crossed herself. I turned off the device for a few days. However, it didn't take long for me to realize that life wouldn't stop. I needed to work, do something. I got a small job at a mechanic's shop in the area, but I felt weak, without energy. The owner noticed and suggested I see a doctor again, but I changed the subject. At night in my grandparents' room, I would light a candle and repeat the prayers that Elijah had taught me. The flame danced in a restless manner, even without wind. Sometimes it would go out for no reason. As the weeks progressed, I became convinced that there was no other way out except a direct confrontation. If I didn't close this cycle, I would forever be trapped in these torments. The idea of seeking Morgan again caused me terror, but it was her or some force linked to her that pursued my steps. Maybe if I confronted her, she would give up or let me explain. Thinking about this sounded naive, but I was cornered. So one night, without telling anyone, I drove to that isolated house where she lived. The rusty gate was partially open. The silence was complete, except for the crickets. I knocked on the door, expecting to find her. Nothing. I waited several minutes until I tried to turn the doorknob. Unlocked, I entered. The living room was dark, only illuminated by the weak moonlight that passed through the window. I called her name with no response. I walked down the corridor and saw that the door to the room where the altar was located was closed. When I touched the doorknob, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. My heart raced. I opened the door to the room. Nothing but darkness. Tap, tap. Light footsteps in the corridor again. I felt a chill. Morgan, I called with a weak voice. A low chuckle echoed, without me identifying the direction. My entire body trembled. With my phone's flashlight, I illuminated the room. The altar seemed disheveled, as if someone had left in a hurry. Bottles knocked over, candles melted on the floor. I couldn't avoid a feeling of panic. It seemed she had left everything on purpose to frighten me. I tried to return to the living room, but I saw the silhouette of someone standing near the window. I screamed, almost dropping my phone. The figure moved outside, quickly disappearing. I didn't wait to know if it was Morgan or someone else. I ran out, got in the car, and left. On the way, I had to stop the vehicle because my hands were shaking so much that I almost caused an accident. With my breathing labored, I wondered if there was anything worse than that feeling of being hunted by an invisible force. When I arrived home, my grandparents were in tears, saying that someone had knocked on the door demanding to speak with me. Since I wasn't there, the person left a message. "Tell him it's too late to regret." My grandmother prayed nonstop. My grandfather looked silently at the street, as if expecting to see something beyond the gate. I put my hands on my head, not knowing what to do. I felt suffocated, as if guilt and dread had become two chains that bound me. The next day, I called Elijah and Ms. Sarah, begging for help. I arranged to meet both of them at Ms. Sarah's house, where we would try a stronger bond-breaking ritual. I told them everything that had been happening, even the invasion of Morgan's house. They exchanged concerned looks. Then Ms. Sarah suggested we try the double mirror method, which, according to her, would allow symbolically confronting whoever was sending me that negativity, returning the evil to its origin. Elijah said it would be risky, because if the person on the other side was indeed making use of dark forces, the reaction could be violent. I was tired of running. I agreed, aware that this might be my last resort. The preparation took a few days. We needed 2 large mirrors, candles, specific prayers. Ms. Sarah studied my symptoms and consulted an old notebook of prayers and charms. My grandfather agreed to help, as he could no longer bear to see me wither away. We scheduled it for a Friday night after 9. The day arrived, and we all went to Ms. Sarah's house. In the spacious living room, she placed the 2 mirrors facing each other, forming a corridor of reflections. We turned off the lights, leaving only candles lit on the sides. Elijah put me in the center, telling me not to look away even if something bizarre appeared. My grandmother stood behind me with a rosary in her hand, mumbling prayers. Ms. Sarah began to invoke a prayer, asking that the true origin of the evil appear, that it be exposed there so we could cut the bond. With each phrase, I felt the air grow heavy. The corridor of mirrors seemed infinite. I could see my own face repeating. Suddenly, I had the impression that in one of the layers of reflection, there was a face that wasn't mine. I blinked, thinking it was an illusion, but the image continued there. A female silhouette with dark eyes staring at me. My entire body got goosebumps. Elijah continued to pray, throwing holy water on the floor. Ms. Sarah asked me to maintain calm. An icy breath ran through the room, and the flames of the candles flickered. I felt dizzy, as if something pulled me by the shoulders. I clenched my fists, fighting against the urge to run away. Then, on the surface of one of the mirrors, the figure seemed to approach, showing traits that resembled Morgan, but it wasn't exactly her. It was something paler, with hard features. I heard a whisper, "You don't escape." My voice cried out Hail Mary loudly, and Ms. Sarah raised her voice, reciting words that I didn't fully understand. Elijah hit the floor with a branch of herbs, repeating my name and ordering the evil to move away. I felt a thud in my chest, a suffocating pressure, and then it was as if I could breathe again. The candles almost went out, but didn't completely extinguish. "Finish it now," shouted Ms. Sarah, handing me a wooden crucifix. With a confused mind, I raised the crucifix in the direction of the mirror. The image disappeared, and a dry crack broke the silence. Elijah covered the mirrors with dark cloths. The heavy sensation in the air began to dissipate gradually. My knees failed, and I knelt on the floor, trying to recompose myself. We managed to weaken the connection, but you have to maintain faith, young man. Any relapse into darkness will reopen the door, warned Ms. Sarah. I agreed, panting. My grandmother hugged me in tears. Elijah recommended that we get rid of those mirrors or keep them in a safe place, never exposing them again. In the following weeks, I returned home, maintaining the routine of praying every night and lighting candles in the corners of my room. My health improved gradually. The dizziness became rare. The fevers disappeared. My grandmother said I was beginning to have color in my face again. The atmosphere in the house became less tense, and I managed to return to work at the mechanic's shop with more enthusiasm. However, I still had occasional nightmares, distorted visions, low laughter, but nothing as suffocating as before. I kept my distance from Morgan. I heard from third parties that she had disappeared from town. They said she might have returned to the region where her supposed relative lived, but nothing was confirmed. Amber, for her part, no longer wanted contact with me. I understood that I needed to move forward in a more honest way, without playing with feelings. I completely stopped flirting with several people at the same time. I truly wanted to heal, not only from the physical evil, but from the evil I myself had cultivated. A month later, I received an anonymous message that simply said, "Still standing." I trembled but tried not to give in to fear. I deleted the message, continued my duties, began to rely on faith and prayers, something I once despised. Whenever a shadow of doubt came to me, I would hold the amulet that Ms. Sarah had given me and think, my path is now different. Today, I feel that the weight of that experience transformed me. I stopped being the conceited guy who didn't care about the consequences of his actions. I suffered physically, psychologically, and almost dragged my grandparents into an endless nightmare. I still carry emotional scars, and sometimes I dream of shadows. But I never again had those intense events of persecution. I became more attentive, respecting the unknown forces that each one carries in their heart. But as a precaution, I keep a small crucifix and the fabric amulet in my pocket. If at any time I feel that cold sensation on my neck or hear unexplainable noises, I squeeze them tightly and pray, remembering everything I went through. It might just be my imagination, but I don't doubt that one day these shadows might try to return. If it happens, I'll be ready to fight, even if it's only with the faith and repentance I carry. And above all, I know that a late apology never fixes what was broken in others' hearts. But learning to respect and not hurt anyone else might be the best way to protect myself and honor what I lived through. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. Hope to see you in the next ones. Now on the screen, I'm going to leave 2 other good videos that I know you'll enjoy. See you there. It had been 5 years since Jake and I started dating, and we'd been talking about marriage pretty naturally from the beginning. In recent weeks, though, the subject had become more frequent. I sensed he was just waiting for the right moment to propose, and my heart would race whenever I thought about it. I'm impatient, I confess. I kept dropping hints that I wanted something special, a memorable surprise. Then one crisp autumn Friday, Jake convinced me to spend a weekend at this historic bed and breakfast in rural Vermont. The place was nestled among maple trees bursting with fall colors, with hiking trails and a small lake just a short walk away. I figured it would just be a relaxing getaway, waking up to the smell of homemade pastries, then exploring the woods or climbing the nearby hill to admire the scenery. It was exactly the kind of thing we both loved doing together. The accommodation was rustic but cozy, and the view of the lake at sunset was breathtaking. On our first evening, the B&B staff announced a special dinner with live music and candles in the outdoor area, next to a garden filled with late-blooming flowers. I happily agreed, not imagining what was coming. We sat at a table arranged on the lawn, with lanterns hanging from tree branches. There was an almost magical atmosphere. At a certain point, the music stopped, and Jake stood up, adjusting his jacket. I noticed his face was pale, kind of nervous. He took a deep breath and pulled a small box from his pocket. I froze, my hands turning ice cold. "I know you wanted something special," he said, his voice slightly trembling. And I couldn't think of anything better than this moment here with nature and candlelight. He opened the box, revealing a ring with a rectangular stone. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a different kind of shimmer, somewhat matte, almost hypnotic. The band was simple silver, without many details. It looked antique, but I liked it. I accepted immediately, almost without thinking. Emotion overwhelmed me so completely that I barely noticed the other guests discreetly applauding. Jake and I embraced, and I felt an enormous relief. It was as if our story, which was already solid, had just taken a leap toward something more definitive. That night before falling asleep, I imagined what our wedding would be like, the flowers, the type of music, the dress. I created beautiful scenes in my head until I dozed off, feeling butterflies of pure anticipation in my stomach. The next morning we woke up early for a hike, but we needed to get back to the city soon because Jake had plans with his father. As we were leaving the B&B, our car got a flat tire. We were stuck there for almost half an hour trying to change it. I could have been irritated, but nothing could shake my mood. I still looked at the ring on my finger, finding everything perfect. We arrived at Jake's parents' house late in the afternoon. They greeted us with hugs and smiles. Richard, Jake's father, wanted to know every detail of the proposal. Nancy, his mother, showed me some magazine clippings with wedding dress designs, all excited. It was a wonderful moment. the feeling of family reunited and confident about the future. Later, Jake drove me to my apartment. I opened the door and found my mother, Sarah, sitting in the living room with a somber expression. My father, Tom, was beside her in silence. I tried to explain that we had been delayed because of the flat tire, but my mother didn't even let me finish. "You didn't say anything," she snapped. I thought something serious had happened. "I don't think it's right to make these decisions behind my back. Jake needs to respect that you still live here part-time." I was confused because I didn't see anything wrong with spending a weekend with my fiancé. Besides, my father wasn't saying anything, just lowering his head as if he wanted to avoid conflict. I tried to share the news of our engagement to lighten the mood, but she shut down completely. "He's not the right man for you. I know he'll end up bringing you problems." She fired off without giving me a chance to speak. "Now you show up with this ring thinking everything's decided." That offended me. Jake tried to justify himself, but she told him to leave. It was a tremendous shock. I ended the night crying in my room, feeling that my mother had humiliated me in front of Jake for no apparent reason. Part of me knew she carried an exaggerated jealousy since I was an only child, but I didn't expect such rudeness. In the following days, she calmed down and explained that she had felt afraid of losing me too soon. I understood her side, although I was still hurt. We made peace, talked it through, and she ended up apologizing, saying she had acted rashly. I was happy to overcome this first barrier. Soon we resumed talking about the wedding. Jake and I chose a date about a year away, enough time to save money and plan everything. During this period, I rushed to look at wedding dresses and told Megan, my best friend since college, that I wanted her as my maid of honor. Initially, she seemed surprised, but didn't react with the enthusiasm I expected. Nevertheless, she accompanied me to a well-known store that made custom dresses. The problem came at the end of our visit when Megan blurted out, "I can't be your maid of honor. I don't have the patience for this. I don't have money to invest in a dress, party, nothing." It sounded so cold that it hurt me. I thought she was depressed for some personal reason, but she didn't want to explain. We left with a heavy atmosphere between us. Weeks later, I found out from another friend that she was going through a complicated divorce. Megan completely distanced herself from me, blocking me on social media. I tried to understand her, but I felt rejected. Everything seemed to be falling apart at the same time. Still, I stayed firm with the preparations. I had a stable job at a marketing agency, but shortly after setting the wedding date, our boss was replaced by the owner's nephew. This guy, though full of grand speeches, didn't understand how our department worked. He demanded impossible results, and if anyone complained, he responded with sarcasm. I started coming home exhausted, with headaches and constant bad moods. Meanwhile, Jake also seemed different. Despite being excited about the engagement, sometimes he became distant, as if he were worried. I thought it was the stress of working at an architectural firm with tight deadlines, but I soon realized he wasn't just tired. He gained several pounds in a few months and got irritated more easily. Our relationship began to cool. We had silly arguments, but they were so intense that they didn't resemble our usual way of being together. We visited a venue, suggested by an acquaintance of his to see if it would work for the reception. It was a disaster. We got lost on the way, argued in the car, arrived late, and the manager could only offer us a quick tour. Impatience consumed me, and I ended up being rude to the staff member who was helping us. Jake tried to stay quiet, but that irritated me even more. I shouted, "You don't even want to get married, do you? You're just pretending." He looked at me indignantly. "If I didn't want to, I wouldn't have bought that ridiculous ring you show off every day." The mention of the ring sent chills down my spine, though I didn't understand why. I shouted back, questioning where he had gotten such a strange piece of jewelry. At this point, I didn't even understand what I was saying. One of the venue employees, frightened, suggested we go to another room to calm down. Before I could move, Jake raised his voice like he'd never done before, pointing out my flaws, saying I was unbearable. I raised my hand to slap him, overcome with anger, but stopped when I caught a glimpse of a reflection in a nearby window, a tall shadow, as if there were another person behind me. For a second, I had the distinct impression that a dark hand was holding my shoulder. I trembled from head to toe. The two employees who were there looked in the same direction and froze. Jake didn't understand anything, and I couldn't explain what I'd seen. My voice simply wouldn't come out. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sudden pain in my right shoulder. We left in a hurry, without signing any contract. In the car, Jake tried to talk, but I just wanted to be silent. That vision had left me terrified. At home, I started having nightmares almost every night. I dreamed of a very tall, thin woman with long hair, and in the dream, she followed me through dark corridors. I felt pain in my shoulder and neck, waking up sweating and crying. At work, my productivity plummeted. The new boss reprimanded me in front of everyone. I sought the company's psychological services and started taking anxiety medication, but I didn't feel better. One morning, while washing my hands in the bathroom sink, I accidentally let the ring slip and fall down the drain. In a panic, I called Jake and my father to help. They dismantled part of the plumbing to recover it, and when they finally pulled it out, the ring emerged covered in a dark, sticky slime. The scene gave me the creeps because I immediately remembered my nightmares. It was after this that I began to feel even greater anguish whenever I looked at the jewelry. A few weeks later, I noticed that my hair was starting to fall out near the top of my head. A small bald spot appeared. I only noticed when my hairdresser alerted me. I panicked. My mother and Nancy offered to help with the wedding preparations, but instead of relieving me, they only suffocated me, trying to impose ideas and interfering with every detail. Jake, noticing my hair in the shower drain, became more concerned, but he was also losing patience. We talked about giving up on the wedding, but we always concluded that we had already made down payments and sent invitations, so it was better to persist. In the middle of this hurricane of feelings, life went on. One afternoon, I received the news that Richard had suffered an accident at the architectural model shop where he worked part-time. A poorly calibrated laser cutter had malfunctioned, burning his shoulder. I rushed to the hospital and found Nancy and Jake in the waiting room. Fortunately, it wasn't extremely serious, but it would require physical therapy and a few weeks of rest. I sat there holding my father-in-law's hand, feeling a strange guilt. I wondered if that accident had any connection with everything that had been happening. While he recovered, I grew closer to Jake's family. I spent my days helping with medical care, and at night, Jake and I returned to talking without arguing. It was almost a relief. During this period, I put the ring aside because one of the nurses recommended that I avoid jewelry in the hospital environment to prevent scratching the patient or getting caught in bandages. For the first time since the engagement, I spent several days without wearing the ring. Curiously, I started sleeping better. The nightmares decreased, the shoulder pains disappeared. Jake also appeared more serene. I thought it might be a coincidence, but something deep inside made me connect the improvement to the absence of the ring. When Richard was discharged, I started wearing the ring again. That same week, I had another nightmare about that long-haired woman. I woke up with the sensation of being grabbed by the shoulders. I mentioned this to Jake, and he, head down, admitted that he had also been feeling suffocated, as if an invisible weight was making him irritable and tired. We felt a twinge of guilt, realizing that since he had given me that ring, our lives had been a mess. He even questioned where he had actually bought the jewelry, as he hadn't purchased it at a conventional store. He said it was from an antique shop in another town, sort of in passing, without a receipt or guarantee. As the wedding date approached, I divided my time between work and final preparations. One day, I went to get alterations on my dress, and the seamstress appeared with a different color, claiming I had requested a change in the fabric shade, which I hadn't. We argued badly. I left the store, got in my car, and cried for hours, parked on a dark street, unable to stop. When I returned home, my mother was waiting for me. As I opened the car door, she let out a muffled scream and pulled me out. "What's that in there behind you?" I looked at the back seat, but saw nothing except some boxes with artificial flowers. She insisted she saw a silhouette crouched down, as if someone were hiding. She turned on her cell phone flashlight, searched the entire vehicle, but we found no one. Still, she was trembling. "I could have sworn there was someone there," she murmured, frightened. I felt a chill, remembering my nightmares and the shadow I'd seen in the reflection at the venue. Before we could talk more, my phone rang. It was Nancy, letting me know that Jake was in the emergency room. He had tripped in his own apartment, hitting his knee on the corner of a piece of furniture. It wasn't serious, but he was in a lot of pain. We rushed to the hospital and found my fiancé with a bandage on his knee. I felt an overwhelming urge to throw the ring away out of so much fear and exhaustion, but I hesitated. It was a symbol of our love, after all. With the wedding approaching, we decided to talk to Alina, a holistic therapist that Nancy knew. Alina did massages, worked with herbs, and claimed to have sensitivity to perceive energies. I, who had always been skeptical, was willing to try anything. We went to her house on a Saturday morning. It was a peaceful environment with plants and the smell of incense. Alina greeted us with a smile and invited us to sit on a sofa covered with raw fabric. I briefly told her about the fights, the stress, and the strange visions. She asked to see the ring, touched it for a moment, and closed her eyes. She stayed like this for a few seconds, breathing deeply. There's a lot of accumulated energy here. It seems that something has impregnated this jewel, something ancient and painful, she said, returning the ring to its box. Often, objects of uncertain origin carry the traumas of those who owned them before. Elena advised us to take the ring to a religious space, any place where we could give it to someone who understood the subject. The denomination didn't matter. The important thing was to get rid of it. I left there with a divided heart. I wanted to get rid of the supposed evil, but at the same time, I felt attached to the ring. It was a gift from Jake, the mark of our engagement. When we told everything to Richard and Nancy, they agreed that we should take action. Jake also was in favor of finding a priest or someone who would agree to keep the ring. I remembered an acquaintance of my family, a pastor who served at a church downtown. We managed to schedule an appointment with him for the following Saturday. Jake, his parents, and I went together. When we arrived, we talked with the pastor, who didn't show excessive surprise. He seemed to have dealt with other cases of loaded objects. He prayed quietly, sprinkled holy water on the ring, and suggested we leave it under the care of the church. He said that if it was indeed a source of imbalance, we shouldn't continue with it. Jake hesitated a bit, but I took the initiative and handed over the box. I felt a tightness in my chest, and at the same time a great relief. As we left, the pastor assured us he would be attentive, but didn't give many details about what he would do with the jewelry. I didn't want to know. I closed my eyes in the car and took a deep breath, with the feeling of having gotten rid of an anchor. Maybe it seems like an exaggeration, but from there, I noticed an immediate improvement in my mood. That night, I slept without startling awake. In the weeks that followed, Jake also appeared to be lighter, happier with life. It seemed that finally, we could plan the wedding in peace. The days went by without major problems. At last, the marked month arrived. I had opted for a new, simpler dress, and bought quality wedding bands at a traditional establishment together with Jake. My mother became more collaborative, although she continued making her acid comments from time to time. Even so, we no longer argued about everything. Megan, the friend who had distanced herself, reappeared one afternoon when I was at a store buying some party favors. She looked worn out, but came to talk to me. Sorry I disappeared. I needed time to deal with my problems, she said, her voice breaking. I hope everything is okay with you. I know I missed important moments, but I'm happy to know you're getting married. I returned the affection and said I understood her difficult time. We didn't become as close as before, but I felt that at least there was no more resentment. This brought me peace. When there were only about 10 days left before the wedding, I went with my mother and some aunts to the hall we had reserved. The place was charming, with a large garden and veranda. We spent the afternoon sorting out decoration details. I no longer felt anxiously negative. It was more like a pleasant butterfly feeling of anticipation. On the eve of the big day, I could hardly close my eyes. I woke up early to do my hair, makeup, and check the dress. We went to the church chosen for the ceremony, small and welcoming, where the same pastor we had sought conducted the ritual. At the time of exchanging rings, a tremor ran through my body, reminding me of how much we had suffered. I looked at Jake, who was smiling, and felt an enormous certainty that everything was in the right place. The reception took place in a space attached to the church itself, where there was a large hall. It was late at night when we started dancing, drinking punch, and cutting the cake. People from my family and his mingled in smiles, and toasts with music in the background. Jake pulled me aside, whispered that he was happy we had left all the bad behind. I agreed, remembering the ring that now belonged to the past. Shortly after the wedding, we moved to a small rented apartment. The environment was simple, but perfect for starting our life together. Without the ring, my nights remained peaceful. My hair grew back where it had fallen out, and my shoulder no longer hurt. Jake also recovered from the extra pounds. At work, I had managed to adapt to the difficult boss, keeping my distance from his provocations. I thought I would never need to remember that jewelry again. But about a month later, Nancy urgently called us to her house. We arrived at night, and she told us she had been hearing strange noises in the empty rooms, footsteps in the hallway, and even saw a shadow moving across the yard. Richard was also complaining about sudden chills and anguish inside the house. At first, we tried to give rational explanations, noise in the plumbing, maybe a cat in the yard. But she insisted it was different, reminiscent of the heavy atmosphere we had faced months before. That bothered me because the idea that something was still haunting us kept me awake. We called the pastor who had kept the ring, but discovered he had been transferred to another city. His replacement knew nothing about the jewelry. We were left without answers, so we thought of Alina, the holistic therapist. She agreed to go to my in-laws' house, bringing herbs and incense burners. She arrived on a cold night, walked through the rooms praying quietly, asking us to open all the windows. At one point, she stopped in front of the hallway where Nancy claimed to see the shadows. She put her hands on the wall and closed her eyes tense. Then she said, "There is some persistent energy here, not necessarily tied to the ring, but perhaps to what it represented." We were disturbed. Alina tried to cleanse the environment with prayers and incense smoke. But in the middle of the night, Nancy had the sensation that a door had slammed shut by itself upstairs. I, who was sleeping on the couch, woke up startled, ran up the stairs, and the door was closed without any wind present. The next day, we found a puddle of water in the hallway with no apparent source. I immediately remembered the day. The ring was unclogged from the plumbing, coming out filthy, and felt my stomach turn cold. Not wanting to frighten the family even more, I discreetly called another pastor that a distant aunt knew. He said he could come, but only in a few weeks. While we waited, my in-laws couldn't remain in the house alone. They came to spend a few days with Jake and me in our cramped apartment. The atmosphere of tension hung in the air, and I feared that this was just a continuation of the torment we thought we had ended. I wondered if we should have destroyed the ring instead of leaving it at the church. After 2 weeks, the pastor arrived, bringing with him some religious objects and a flask of holy water. He walked through the corridors of the house, praying in each corner, and asked us to repeat prayers aloud. Alina also attended, helping to fumigate the environments. At one point, the pastor stopped in front of Nancy's bedroom, looked carefully at the wall, and stated he felt something very heavy there. With calm and patience, he continued praying. There was no spectacular scene, but everyone could tell how nervous we all were, paying attention to every noise, every gust of wind. After almost 2 hours, the pastor instructed us to keep the house well ventilated, to avoid storing objects of dubious origin, and to continue with daily prayers. At the end, He thanked us for the hospitality and left. We spent that night there. No doors were heard slamming. No puddle of water appeared, and Nancy managed to sleep without nightmares. We believed that finally the cleansing had worked. Gradually, things got sorted out. My in-laws returned to their routine without strange manifestations. Alina recommended that they continue lighting white candles once a week, just to reinforce the harmony. Everything finally seemed peaceful. We still don't know if that remnant of energy had a direct connection to the ring, or if it was the fruit of the tensions we lived through. It could be that our own minds and conflicts created this suffocating climate. Or maybe there was indeed something beyond what we can prove. But what's certain is that without the jewelry, and after this ritual, the house calmed down. Today, Jake and I live peacefully. We continue in our modest apartment. He returned to work without major problems, and I gradually adapted to the office environment, maintaining better mental health with the help of a psychologist. The memory of this whole episode still gives me chills. Sometimes I enter an antique store with friends to look at decorative pieces and feel an involuntary shiver, as if recognizing the feeling of danger. Then I remember how much we suffered and conclude that I would never buy something without knowing for sure where it came from. The feeling is that we overcame adversity. Even with some inevitable couple squabbles, I feel there is more lightness in the air. My mother occasionally drops a hint that she doesn't trust anything too old, but I believe it's just her way of alerting me not to repeat the experience of bringing an object of unknown origin into the house. My father maintains his quieter stance, but I noticed he started praying a bit more before going to bed. Nancy and Richard are making small renovations to their house without any further scares. Megan is still in the process of reorganizing her life, but we talk occasionally. The important thing is that the dark chapter is behind us. As for the ring, we never heard about it again. Maybe it's still kept in the church, or it's been discarded. It doesn't matter to me, actually. I prefer to move forward. I've set aside the obsession with an extraordinary engagement ring. Today, I look at the simple wedding band that Jake and I exchanged at the altar and feel that this discreet circle on my finger is much more valuable because it doesn't carry ghosts from the past. Only the promise that we'll face any difficulty together, whether it's real or something that can't be seen with the naked eye. If I've learned anything, it's not to underestimate coincidences or ignore my own instincts. Sometimes an object, an idea, or even a family grudge can take shape, growing and sinking us into a spiral of fear. But if we're attentive, we have a chance to free ourselves before plunging into an endless abyss. Jake and I had help from people who cared about us, and somehow we faced each challenge. I prefer to look at it this way. It's not that supernatural forces exist everywhere, but if they do, may we know when to step back and seek support. Life is already quite complicated on its own. The last thing we need is an invisible burden knocking us down. All in all, I feel grateful that everything ended well. When I hear strange noises at night, I still shudder slightly. But then I remember that we did everything to ward off any evil. I also understood that nothing is definitive, that evil can manifest not only in external phenomena, but in our own actions and harsh words when we are unbalanced. Today, I keep the hope that the dark phase has been left behind as we build our life together, with our feet on the ground and leaving no empty spaces for shadows to settle in. Good evening, folks. My name's Sarah. I grew up in a forgotten mining town in the Appalachian Mountains, where winter winds cut through your bones and summer heat pressed down like an iron. We endured temperatures colder than anyone could imagine, and when the spring thaws came, the mud swallowed our boots, leaving a sour smell clinging to everything around us. My mother, Diane, was known for two things: her explosive temper and the cheap whiskey she drank from morning till night. The house we lived in was a ramshackle trailer with a rusted metal roof. When it rained hard, water dripped from every corner. When the sun beat down, that roof turned into a sizzling hot plate. I was less than 10 years old when I learned complaining did no good. For as long as I can remember, my mother treated me like some kind of burden. The story goes that my father left when I was still a baby, and she always told me the reason was my fragile health, my constant nighttime coughing, my crying that irritated her. I grew up hearing I was to blame for his escape and for all the misfortune surrounding us. I never knew him, never saw any photos hidden in drawers. When I tried asking more about him, my mother threw a piece of firewood in my direction, screaming for me to never mention the subject again. I remember the smell of alcohol that permeated my mother's clothes. In the morning, she'd wake up and immediately take a swig from an old dark bottle, the kind bought in distant liquor stores. When she had no money to buy more, her mood got even worse. I tried to stay quiet, but all it took was a cup left out of place or beans burned in the pot for her to unleash her anger on me. I hated washing dishes in such a hurry, because she'd watch me from time to time, cigarette hanging from her mouth, just waiting for a slip-up to yell at me or slap me. If you keep washing those plates that way, you'll end up breaking everything, you pest, she'd say, shaking the bottle as if threatening me. I'd lower my eyes, quietly agree, and continue scrubbing. I learned early on not to raise my voice. Any attempt at defense earned me pinches, hair pulling, or objects flying in my direction. It was a daily tension. If I dropped a towel on the floor, she'd call me clumsy and hit me with her slipper. If I swept and forgot a corner, an even worse insult would follow. At 7, my mother enrolled me in the local school. Actually, it was a teacher who lived nearby who insisted, noticing I was practically trapped at home without education. I had to walk about 20 minutes along a dirt path to reach the school, and I did this alone. When it didn't rain, dust would rise around my feet, staining my clothes. I didn't have a uniform. I wore old dresses that hung loose on my body. Often, I went with them torn or tied at the waist with string. The other children, curious, asked why I didn't have a decent backpack, why my shoes were different. I would shrink back and pretend not to hear, fearing that if any of these questions reached my mother's ears, she'd use a belt to teach me to respect family. During breaks, classmates would share snacks, smile, and play jump rope. I'd sit in a corner eating whatever I managed to bring from home, sometimes just a piece of stale bread. One of these classmates, Jenny, shared a piece of cake with me on a certain occasion. I thanked her, but when my mother found out I had accepted food from someone else, she reacted furiously, hitting me on the legs with a maple branch and screaming across the yard. You think you're going to fool everyone with that poor little face. I don't want you lowering yourself to anyone, understand?" There was no chance to question. I followed her command, trying not to cry. As the years passed, my mother tried to earn some money selling homemade pies and pastries at the town entrance. To save money, she made everything at home, forcing me to help. She'd wake me before sunrise. "Get up, Sarah, help me knead the dough." "Mom, I'm sleepy." I barely had the strength to speak. "Sleepy nothing. If we don't sell these pies, we don't eat tomorrow." And she'd yank me by the arm. The treats she prepared were actually tasty, but she made everything amid shouts, smoking and dropping ashes in the sink. After the pies were ready, she forced me to sell them door to door. I'd walk around the town calling, "Fresh pies. Fresh pies." Some neighbors took pity and bought to help me, but if I returned with 2 or 3 unsold pies, my mother would curse at me. "Is that how you thank me for everything I do? Can't even sell half a dozen pies. You're good for nothing." When I was 8, money got tighter and she began drinking more frequently. They said she'd had problems with her family many years ago, but nobody wanted to get involved. People knew about the beatings I received, but never called the police or any social services. There were even those who tried, but my mother made a scene and threatened to burn down the house of anyone who meddled. In the end, everyone kept quiet. In our town, everyone minded their own business, and those who tried to help ended up in trouble. It was during this time that I met a woman named Alina, who sold vegetables at the makeshift farmer's market in town. She'd see me passing with the basket of pies, and sometimes gifted me with a bunch of kale leaves, a tomato, a piece of sweet potato. It was a big help, but I trembled every time I arrived home with those things. My mother was suspicious about where I got the food. When she discovered Alina was giving me vegetables, she went to her stand and complained. I didn't ask for handouts. "Stay out of my life, old woman." Alina gave me a pitying look, but backed down without responding. She knew that confronting my mother would only make everything worse. But one day, Alina called me aside and said, "Child, if you need anything, come to my house. Don't let your mother do anything worse to you." I didn't know what to say, just nodded, swallowing hard, thanked her, and ran away, afraid my mother would discover even this conversation. By 9, I was already sweeping, cooking, and washing clothes. My hands were always calloused from scrubbing fabric in the wash tub. The beatings continued frequently, and I tried not to complain to anyone, even at school. When I showed up with bruises, teachers asked questions, but I always invented a story about falling or a household accident. I didn't want to risk telling the truth because I knew Diane's fury. I had witnessed her threatening people with bottles and knives over trivial matters. The school principal even tried to contact Child Protective Services, but they, without support and afraid of confrontation, never really committed to visiting us. One day, I was late coming back from school because there was a group project, and I stayed to finish it. When I got home, she was waiting for me at the door, hands on her hips, shaking her head in disapproval. Without letting me explain, she pulled me in by the arm and hit me with a piece of wood on my thigh. I felt such pain I could barely stand. She screamed, "I'll teach you not to loiter around." "Where were you?" "At school, Mom," I tried to say. "School," she mocked. "You think you can fool me. You must be out there doing wrong things." That hurt me not just physically, but in my soul. I realized that for her, I would never be worthy of a gesture of affection. When I turned 10, something even stranger began happening in our house. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up hearing my mother mumbling alone, as if talking to someone in the next room. Once I gathered the courage to get closer and heard disconnected phrases about binding the life of anyone who dares to interfere with my plans, and holding on to those who try to escape. It gave me chills. I thought she was delirious from drinking, but this happened repeatedly, and on certain mornings, I found strange containers hidden behind furniture with dark liquids and the smell of rotting meat. I didn't quite understand what it was, only came to suspect witchcraft or something similar when I found a small bundle made with thick fabric tied, with colored thread hidden under her bed. I opened it slowly and saw it contained nail fragments, hair strands, and something like candle pieces. I backed away disgusted, but the idea of confronting her didn't even cross my mind. I closed everything the way it was and put it back in place, trembling with fear. One late afternoon, I was called to a leaner's house to deliver some vegetables my mother had asked to resell at our makeshift stand. I was surprised to see that a leaner had a worried look. "Sarah, be careful," she warned quietly while putting the vegetables in the bag. "Your mother's been doing some strange things, talking to herself, and this could splash back on you." Pretending not to understand, I just thanked her and left. Later, I discovered that my mother and a leaner had argued because my mother accused her of casting the evil eye on us. What irony, the one using sinister objects at home was precisely Diane, not a leaner. Each day, tension at home increased. My mother slept less, drank more, and sometimes spent hours secluded in her room without coming out even to eat. When she reappeared, she was more furious and hurled insults that hurt my heart. At 11, I stopped school altogether. My mother claimed I needed to work full-time at the stands and on household chores. The school teacher even tried to convince me to stay, but my mother was categorical. "Study for what? You think you're going to be a doctor. You're going to work and help support this house." That was the end of my school life. I became practically her slave from sunrise to sunset. I delivered and sold homemade products, washed other people's clothes, did housekeeping for neighbors when the opportunity arose. The money, of course, went all to my mother's hands, who spent it on drink. When the town had some festival or parade, I'd hear laughter and music in the distance, but I was always busy, unable to participate. Sometimes, while scrubbing pots, I'd see fireworks in the sky and wonder if one day I'd be entitled to any joy. It was on a night when I was hanging clothes on the line that everything became even darker. My mother, staggering, called me to the kitchen. She had eyes red with anger. "Come here, you wretched thing," she shouted, pointing to a corner. "Have you been messing with my things?" "No, Mom, I don't even go into your room," I responded, frightened. "Liar. I know you snoop where you shouldn't." She grabbed my arm forcefully. "If you tell anyone what you saw, you're dead, understand?" I was so terrified I felt my heart race. I just nodded without saying anything. She grabbed a knife and lightly pressed it against my face. "If I find out you opened your mouth to any neighbor, you'll regret it." I could smell the alcohol on her breath, the whiskey stench. She released me soon after, and I ran to my room trembling. I spent the night wide awake, recalling each blow, each threat, and feeling that my life was turning into a dead end. At 12, I had a moment of hope. Alina herself offered me a side job to help in her garden, promising decent payment and even a daily meal. She needed me to water plants, pull weeds, and help with the harvest. At first, my mother complained and cursed, but when she saw she'd receive part of the money, she decided to let me go. It was working in this garden that I met Michael, Alina's nephew, who sometimes came to help. He was almost my age, a little older, and was calm. He began talking to me without reservations, asking if I liked the garden, what my routine was like. I, who lived isolated, was surprised by his kindness. "Sarah, if you ever need anything, tell me. My aunt likes you a lot," he said one day while we were pulling weeds from a lettuce bed. "Thank you, but I prefer not to bother anyone," I murmured, already accustomed to not forming bonds. Even so, Michael continued to start conversations during breaks. He talked about music, childhood games, and even lent me old books he found. I leafed through those pages like someone discovering a new world, but read in secret, in the middle of the night, to not awaken my mother's wrath. One afternoon, I stayed longer than usual in the garden, talking with him, sitting under a tree. It was innocent. We talked about the sky, the birds, the desire to know other places. I felt strangely good, but the sun was already low when I returned home. As soon as I entered, I found my mother staring at me. She shouted, "Where have you been? Are you going crazy coming home at this hour?" I replied that I was in the garden, but she didn't believe me. She hit me with a slipper until my arm was red, screamed horrible things, insinuating I must have met a boy to lose myself. Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't retort. I learned that silence was survival. In the following days, I tried to be quick in the garden to get home earlier. Michael found my change in attitude strange. He'd ask if everything was okay. I, embarrassed, would respond that I needed to help my mother. He didn't insist, but looked at me with compassion. However, one weekend, he appeared with an illustrated book about medicinal plants and called me to look at some pictures. I got excited and was distracted for longer than I should have, analyzing the colorful images. When I ran home, it was already dusk. I got chills just imagining how I'd find my mother. And indeed, the violence I suffered that night was the worst yet. She beat me with a rubber hose, threw me to the ground, stepped on my hair, screaming that she wouldn't allow herself to be deceived. When the beating ended, my entire body ached. I crawled to a corner of my room, stayed there curled up for hours without eating or drinking water. The next day, I could barely walk properly, but I needed to get up to work in the garden, or she'd be even more furious. Alina was startled by my condition, asked what had happened. I made up an excuse that I had slipped. I don't know if she believed me, but she didn't insist. She gave me a hot tea and asked me to rest a little. "Later you can work, child. First recover." I returned home with my eyes lowered because I knew if my mother noticed someone had cared for me, she could cause a scene. And so I continued, without the courage to ask anyone for help. As if all this wasn't enough, I began to suspect my mother was performing rituals against Michael. Once she saw me talking to him from afar in Alina's yard. The next day, I found in a corner of the kitchen a small piece of dirty cloth wrapped around something that looked like small animal bones. and a paper with his name written, along with strange phrases. I couldn't avoid despair. I feared she would try to harm him, as she did with anyone who got close to me. As weeks passed, Michael got sick. He had cut himself on a barbed wire fence, and the wound got severely infected. Fever soon followed, and he needed to be taken to a health clinic in another town. I was informed by a leaner that he was very weak, unable to eat. A deep fear struck me. I had heard rumors that my mother was involved in spells and bindings. I didn't know how far this was real or coincidence, but Michael's sudden illness following the cut seemed like a terrible warning. One day, upon arriving home, I heard my mother talking to herself, laughing softly. I peeked through the crack in the room and saw her holding a clay pot where something misshapen floated. I moved closer without her noticing and saw Michael's name inscribed on a soaked paper outside the pot. Hanging on the side was a string with dark feathers. The smell was nauseating. I felt a rage I had never experienced before. She was attacking the only person who had shown kindness to me. I decided I needed to do something. Even without understanding anything about witchcraft, I recalled the bundle I had seen long ago, the filthy vials hidden in the yard. I thought, if she can do evil, maybe I can return that evil to her. It was a dangerous thought. I remember one quiet night waiting for her to fall into a deep sleep. Then I crept into the yard and looked for pieces of paper and objects she used. I ended up finding a shell necklace she had kept for years, a gift that, according to her, had come from my father. I took the necklace and a piece of old cloth. I tried to imitate what I had seen, wrapped that necklace along with a handful of dirt and rotten herbs, scribbled her name on a paper, dirtying it with coffee grounds, as I had heard from a neighbor that intention and energy could suffice in a ritual. I whispered lowly, "If there is power in hatred, may it return to the one who generated it." My hands trembled, my heart raced. I felt guilt and fear simultaneously, but the fury I nurtured for the life I led propelled me. In the days that followed, my mother began complaining of strong pains, first in her stomach, then in her head. She didn't stop drinking, but vomited frequently. Behind her back, I observed the situation with a mixture of horror and relief. Horror from knowing that somehow I had contributed to it, and relief from seeing her weakened, less inclined to hit me. At the same time, Michael continued ill. Alina tried everything, took him to other places, sought medicines, but his recovery was slow. One afternoon, she called me aside and told me that some tests had detected a serious and advanced infection. He would need to be hospitalized, and due to lack of resources, would be transferred again. I felt a tightness in my chest, but couldn't visit him. My mother wouldn't let me, and I also feared being blamed if any misfortune happened along the way. Meanwhile, Diane became more aggressive. Even without strength, she still cursed at me. There were moments when she screamed my name in the middle of the night, accusing me of being a traitor, as if guessing my involvement with that small ritual. "Sarah, you wretch, you think you're going to fool me," she'd yell while I curled up in my room. As days passed, she wasted away visibly. Her skin began developing dark spots, and the mixed smell of sweat and drink was unbearable. Sometimes she was so weak she wouldn't get out of bed. At other times, she'd suddenly wake up and call me to fetch more whiskey from the store. And I'd go, because if I didn't, she'd make a scene that would wake half the town. One morning, I returned from the store and found her talking to someone invisible, sitting on the floor. She hugged a bundle and repeated, "I'm going to keep you here even if I rot with you." I got chills. Until then, as much as I suspected witchcraft, I didn't think she was out of her mind to that extent. I tried to approach, but she looked at me with an almost palpable hatred, as if she hated me just for existing. I backed away feeling nauseous. That house was taken by a heavy air, a heat that seemed to come from beneath the earth. On a stormy night, while I tried to sleep in my room, I heard a dull thud and the sound of something breaking. I ran to see what was happening. My mother had stumbled in the kitchen and was lying down, holding her leg. There were glass shards around, probably from one of the bottles. She looked at me and whispered, "Help me, Sarah." It was the first time she had asked for help in so long. I couldn't move. I remembered the times she hit me without reason, the way she threatened me with a knife, the spells against Michael. She noticed my hesitation and began shouting profanities. The rain outside muffled her curses, but I still heard everything clearly. I walked out slowly, leaving her there on the floor, and returned to my room. I spent the night crying silently, terrified by my own coldness. But I felt it was either that or sinking completely. In the following days, she dragged herself around the house, limping with her injured leg. She didn't seek a doctor, didn't allow any neighbor to enter. Her fever increased. Her skin, previously spotted, began showing something like sores that oozed. The smell was so strong it made me gag. I opened the windows to ventilate, but she complained about the draft. "Cursed girl, you want me to die of cold. Close that window. It's just to let out the smell, Mom," I tried to argue. "Shut up, daughter of worthless people," and she spat on the floor. There were moments when I thought about asking Alina for help, but something inside me said that if she got close, my mother could make her sick too. At the same time, I felt responsible for part of that evil, as I had performed a ritual without knowing what it was about. Between guilt and resentment, I remained silent. One dawn, she began screaming desperately, saying she was rotting alive. You could hear her body dragging on the wooden floor. When I gathered courage to go there, I found the mattress soaked with a dark liquid mixed with vomit and blood. Flies united. I approached holding my nose, and she begged me for help. I tried to lift her trunk, but she screamed in pain, complaining, "You're not even good enough to carry me. Get out of my sight," and pushed me. I shrank in a corner, seeing her in that state. I tried to think what to do, take her to the health clinic, risk her blaming me later, or trying more spells against me. I spent hours stuck in that impasse, hearing her moans until they quieted. By morning, exhausted, I continued my routine of taking and bringing things from the store. But fewer and fewer people wanted to deal with us, as the smell of rot was notorious. They said around town that Diane was possessed. Others believed the whiskey had destroyed her body. Whatever it was, she was wasting away fast. Shortly after, the news came that Michael had died in the other city. The infection advanced too far, and he didn't resist. My world collapsed. I felt a hole in my chest, as if there was no more ground. He who treated me with gentleness had been ripped from life so cruelly. I cried alone, swallowing each sob, remembering the paper with his name my mother had left in the pot. At that moment, hatred took over me. That same night, she called me from the room with a trembling voice. Sarah. Sarah, I entered slowly. She was lying down, covered in dark spots. Her face swollen, lips cracked, an unbearable odor. I was seized by a fury I had never before experienced. I remembered Michael, my destroyed childhood, and how she had transformed me into a creature without dreams. She stammered, I think I'm going to die. I didn't respond, just stared at her, feeling my eyes wet with resentment. She continued, you need to take care of me, take care of you. After everything, came out of my mouth almost without control. She twisted, a gush of blood staining the quilt. At that moment, something broke inside me. I just left and closed the door. I spent the night hearing her moans until they silenced for good. In the morning, I noticed there was no more sound at all. I entered and confirmed she was dead. Flies circled her body, and the rot was indescribable. I felt a relief that mixed with guilt. I remained static for a while, unable to cry, not knowing what to do. I knocked on a neighbor's door, asked for help. The people who arrived were shocked by the scene. They wrapped her body in some cloth and took it to be buried in a common grave. Some went so far as to comment they would call the sheriff from the region, but gave up when they remembered Diane's reputation and the local lack of structure. Nobody asked official questions. Perhaps they even knew what was happening, but preferred to ignore it. After the burial, I was left alone with the house that seemed more like a den of bitter memories. I threw away all the bottles and tore the sheets. I broke some objects she used in rituals. The smell still permeated the walls. Alina appeared, hugged me without saying anything. A silent embrace from someone who understands another's suffering. She asked if I wanted to stay at her house, but I thought I would be a burden. I gathered some clothes, a little money that remained, and left to find my way far from there. I took an old bus that stopped on the main road. I made that journey without looking back. The jostling of the vehicle made me nauseated, but I just thought about disappearing from that place and from the image of my mother. I missed Michael and cried softly in the seat while the dry landscapes passed by the window. When I reached the destination, a more urban center, I didn't know anyone. I walked the streets until I found a simple boarding house managed by a lady named Martha, who let me stay in a tiny room in the back, as long as I paid a modest amount. I used my little money, without being sure how I would survive in the coming days. In the boarding house corridors, I heard strange footsteps, creaks in the walls. I also sometimes heard a voice I thought was my mother's, but it must have been a product of my fear and guilt, as there was nothing there. At night, it took me long to sleep, always with the fear that that figure would rise from the grave to haunt me. Memories persisted, the smell of rot, the purple marks on my body, Michael in a hospital bed. I arranged a precarious job in a nearby diner, cleaning the floor and washing glasses. The owner, Mr. Ross, paid me a pittance, but at least I could eat a sandwich at the end of the day. Shortly after, I had to leave the tiny boarding house room as the price increased and I couldn't pay. I ended up sleeping in an improvised room behind the diner itself, a space full of cleaning product boxes. Despite everything, life seemed somehow less suffocating than before. Nobody hit me, nobody cursed at me. I slept little, was afraid, but there was no longer the figure of my mother to humiliate me. Still, she inhabited me in nightmares almost every night. I dreamed of her rotting face calling for me and woke up in a cold sweat. After a few weeks, I met a woman named Grace who frequented the diner. She was a cook in a nursing home nearby and mentioned they needed help with cleaning and caring for the elderly. I went there, introduced myself, and got the job. I still lived scared, but it was a better job. I began sharing a small room in the back with a colleague named Rose, who also worked in the kitchen at the nursing home. The routine was tough, cooking for the elderly, cleaning bathrooms, taking some of them for a bath. But there was a less hostile climate than in my old house. Little by little, I got used to it, until one night I woke up with Rose shaking me. "Sarah, what was that screaming?" "You were crying loudly." I realized I had a terrible nightmare in which my mother pulled me by the hair, dragging me down a dark corridor. My heart racing, I sat up in bed trying to catch my breath. Rose offered me a glass of water. "You need to calm down. Looks like you saw a ghost." In a way, that's what I felt. Diane's shadow still circled me. No matter how much I tried to move forward, it haunted me to think that I had somehow contributed to that horrible death. Over time, I heard rumors among the nursing home staff about a healer named Ruth, who sometimes prayed for some of the elderly and said mysterious words to ward off burdens. When I gathered the courage, I sought Ruth. She received me in an empty room of the nursing home where wheelchairs were stored. "Child, I see you carry something heavy," she said, closing her eyes for a moment. "Want to tell me?" I opened up a little, but didn't go into details about the ritual I did. I told of the suffering, the hatred that remained between me and my mother, and the nightmares that wouldn't let me sleep. "Can you pray for me?" "I can pray, yes, but forgiveness begins within you," Ruth responded with a calm voice. "If you feel guilty, you need to understand that you did what you thought necessary. Free your mother from this hatred." She asked me for an object or photo of my mother, but I had nothing. So she suggested that on a quiet night, I make a solitary prayer, lighting a candle. I felt a strange fear, as candles and spells reminded me of the dark scenes of Diane. Still, I decided to try. One dawn, I took advantage of the empty nursing home dining room, placed a candle on the table, and thought of my mother. My breathing quickened as I remembered her face, the wounds, the look of fury. I tried to pronounce some words asking that she find peace, that she not keep haunting me. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything supernatural, just cried softly until the candle burned almost completely. I felt a strange lightness after that. In the following days, I continued having nightmares, but less intense. I managed to work better without so much agony. Rose noticed I seemed calmer. I began saving a little money, thinking maybe about renting a small room and having my space. The elderly at the nursing home grew fond of me. Some told their stories, and I saw that each carried a painful past in their own way. With time, that routine brought a kind of peace. I continued waking up early, cooking, cleaning, but without feeling fear of getting a beating or an insult at any moment. It was like re-educating my heart. More than a year has passed since my mother's death. I never returned to the town, nor do I know if the house is still there, or if Alina continued selling vegetables. Sometimes I miss her and imagine she's overcome the departure of Michael. but I myself didn't want to know anything more from there. I prefer to keep my distance from that past. Today I still carry marks, both physical and emotional, the scars on my arms, the tiredness in my eyes. But gradually, I've been able to sleep without waking up screaming, without thinking my mother will appear in the dark. There are nights when I dream of Michael smiling, showing a book, and this brings me a painful peace, because I know I couldn't save him. I still wonder if everything was a work of chance, or if indeed Diane's witchcraft played a role in his destruction. Be that as it may, I continue firm, trying not to let that terrible chapter define who I am forever. I learned in the hardest way that hatred generates a cycle that can ruin lives, and if I don't watch myself, I'll forever be a prisoner of resentment and guilt. Sometimes I think that if one day I have my own family, I will never repeat what I lived through. I'll offer the love I didn't have. I'll make sure no child feels as much fear as I felt. Meanwhile, I continue my life among pots, mops, and the serene voices of the elderly, finding in the small kindnesses of daily life the courage to continue. Hey folks, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I launch new videos every day here. Hope to see you in the next ones. Now on screen, I'll leave 2 other good videos that I know you'll enjoy. See you there. Good evening to Dom and everyone in the Evoking Fear community. My name is Peter, and tonight I'm sharing something that has haunted me since I understood how I came into this world. Some time ago, I needed to revisit a past that most people would prefer to bury. I don't do this out of bravery, but out of a strange necessity to understand the shadows that haunt my family. I was raised by my mother, Sarah, in a simple house on the outskirts of a small town in rural Montana. We didn't have much comfort, but there was plenty of silence and veiled memories. Sometimes she would look at me with such dense sadness that I wondered what could have marked her that way. When I was around 16, she became gravely ill. It was during this phase that she told me her story, and consequently mine. I lost her not long ago. Before dying, my mother wanted me to know everything that had happened between her and my biological father, Vince, and why I shouldn't let myself be seduced by the same forces that destroyed him. At the time, I confess, I didn't understand half the things she narrated. She spoke of prayers, abuse, and a huge cat that, according to her, carried a kind of curse. At first, I thought they were delusions from her illness. However, after I went searching for answers, I realized there's more mystery in this world than our reason admits. My mother was born in an isolated homestead, miles from any urban center in the late 1980s. She was the only child of grandparents who followed harsh customs, believing that a woman should marry young so as not to dishonor the family or become a burden. She used to tell me that when she was only 15, her parents accepted a marriage proposal from Vince, a 24-year-old man well regarded in the local community for having some cattle and fertile land. According to my mother, Vince was apparently polite in front of elders, but had a difficult temperament, something no one seemed to openly discuss. On their wedding day, my mother wore what could be described as a simple white dress, hastily sewn by a neighbor. The wedding was celebrated in the only community hall in the area, with many people gathered to see the girl who would become a woman. My mother remembered them smiling at her as if it were a happy event, but internally she carried terror. She didn't fully understand what it meant to be a wife, nor did she have the courage to contradict her parents. So at the height of her adolescence, she moved to Vince's house in the winter of 1993. The first few weeks weren't so bad. She did everything to keep the house clean, learned simple recipes, and tried to understand Vince's routine. He would leave early in the morning to work the land and return at nightfall. But gradually, what was light transformed into a heavy atmosphere. Vince began to complain about everything she did, raging at every detail that didn't match his taste. Any dirty dishes in the sink or food without salt was reason for shouting and insults. My mother was becoming a shadow of herself. She said there wasn't a moment of peace because Vince's complaints were endless. When rumors began that the couple needed an heir, neighbors started asking when there would be a baby. My mother felt pressured, but she just couldn't get pregnant, and this became a point of discord at home. Vince blamed her directly, claiming she was defective. The verbal abuse increased and mixed with shoves. Over time, the shoves turned into punches and slaps, wounds she couldn't show anyone. In front of the community, Vince continued to be the good rural property owner, the one who helped with small projects in the region. No one seemed to notice, or wanted to notice, what was happening within those four walls. My mother felt trapped because she had no one to count on. Her grandparents lived far away and were the first to say that a marriage should be forever. The women there, for the most part, lived in similar situations, so no one offered refuge. It was then that Vince became even more involved with gambling. Almost every night, he would escape to some bar where he would meet with ranch hands and other men to play cards. There he would bet small savings, work tools, and even parts of his own cattle. When he lost, he would return disturbed, and invariably my mother paid the price. One late afternoon in the autumn of 1994, he stormed out and announced he was going to gamble until sunrise. She was relieved for a few hours of respite, but at the break of dawn, he appeared stumbling into the kitchen. In his arms, he carried a large cat with dark fur that moved so silently, it almost seemed like a shadow. She was still awake, sitting in a corner, and was startled to see him. "Look what I won at this bar," Vince said, laughing in a strange way as if dismissing it. "Some wretch swore this animal is worth more than gold." Nonsense, but anyway, here it is. My mother didn't know what to respond. The cat stared at Vince with deep eyes. She noticed that when the feline laid its gaze on her, it showed no fear. On the contrary, it had an almost defiant calmness. It was as if the animal already knew every detail of that environment, and somehow my mother felt a chill run down her spine, as if something was going to happen from then on. Vince didn't name the cat. He threw it on the barn floor and left a bowl of milk that was already turning sour. He went to sleep, locking the bedroom door without caring if my mother needed anything. The next morning, the cat was still there, licking drops of milk. My mother, compassionate, put fresh water and a little food. Silently, it simply observed her every move. Time passed, and the cat grew closer to my mother. At home, she had almost no one to talk to, so she began to speak quietly with the animal, calling it Shadow because of the color of its fur. Shadow, a silent companion, seemed to understand her emotions. Whenever my mother cried, It would lie nearby, emitting low, almost imperceptible purrs. That presence strangely comforted her. One day, my mother noticed she was feeling nauseous and frequently dizzy. A neighbor, whom she asked to keep a secret, explained they were signs of pregnancy. To confirm, she did a very rudimentary home test, but it indicated positive. Having no other option, she revealed the news to Vince during breakfast. He dropped his cup on the table and looked at her with a confused expression. Then he smiled smugly. Finally, let's see who will doubt my masculinity now. He didn't ask about her condition. He just boasted about having an heir. My mother didn't know whether to be happy or frightened. In any case, she thought that the arrival of a child might soften Vince's temperament. But what happened was the opposite. He began to drink and gamble even more, justifying that a man about to be a father deserves to have some fun. He would frequently return intoxicated, and if he was in a bad mood, he would take it out on her, even while she was pregnant. One night, when my mother was already carrying about 5 months of pregnancy, Vince arrived in the early hours. He burst through the door without caring if the light was off or if she was sleeping. He called her name, shouting. Frightened, she ran to see what was happening. Vince was trembling with rage. I lost all my money and a bull in the game. Those scoundrels cheated me. She tried to calm him down, but he pushed her against the wall. With the force of the impact, she fell to her knees. He continued complaining, and then he beat her mercilessly. My mother could only protect herself as best as she could, fearing for the child she carried. She felt heavy blows to her back and finally passed out. When she regained consciousness, she was already in a small improvised infirmary miles away. A nurse was tending to her wounds. Realizing her belly was no longer intact, she became desperate. Between sobs, she learned that the baby had not survived. This broke my mother inside. She wasn't even of legal age, but she had already lost a child in a brutal way. Vince appeared some time later with swollen eyes. He asked for forgiveness and said it wasn't intentional. She couldn't look at him. However, having nowhere to go, she ended up returning to his house when she was discharged. From then on, my mother entered a kind of apathy. She did everything mechanically, cooked, cleaned, and kept a distant gaze. She spoke only what was necessary. Vince sometimes tried to redeem himself, but repeated the same cycle of drinking and violence. She no longer reacted. It was during this phase that shadow began to approach her more, hardly leaving her side. The cat would sleep in any corner, but when my mother cried at night, it would appear and nestle at her feet. The neighbors commented that the cat brought some misfortune, but no one said it openly in front of Vince. And then the man began to show strange symptoms: constant fever, skin rashes, and a fatigue that prevented him from working. He sought doctors, but no one found a cause. He was wasting away. He could no longer handle the tools on the land, nor drink as before. It seemed that something was sucking him from within. One afternoon in the early winter of 1995, a well-known faith healer in the region, Miss Carmen, appeared at the door of the house. She said she had heard comments about his illness and offered to see the sick man. She entered the room, examined the wounds, said prayers, and as she left, called my mother aside. There's something here that doesn't belong. This cat you have, be careful not to keep it under the same roof. This animal is not just any cat. My mother listened silently. Miss Carmen's gaze was serious. She then whispered that she had seen a similar case elsewhere, when a man won an animal in a game and began to mysteriously fall ill. Vince, in desperation, clung to the only hope he could have. He told my mother to expel the cat from the house. Since she no longer had the strength to disagree, she took Shadow in her arms and took it to where her parents lived, begging them to take care of the animal for a few days. Despite finding the situation strange, they accepted. She returned to Vince's house without the cat, but without truly believing that this would save him. Vince's health, contrary to what was expected, deteriorated even more rapidly. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, and when he tried to speak, only meaningless murmurs came out. My mother limited herself to observing. The memories of the lost baby and how much he had abused her formed a wall of resentment that she couldn't break through. On a very cold night, Vince breathed his last. My mother held the vigil practically alone. The few who came to offer condolences avoided looking into her eyes. When they finished sealing the coffin, she said she felt a relief, not jubilation, but relief for no longer needing to fear. A few weeks later, my mother realized she was pregnant again. It was news both frightening and redemptive. Knowing nothing more tied her to that house and those lands, she decided to sell them. With the money, she left to start life elsewhere. Before leaving, she retrieved Shadow from her grandparents' house. The cat was calm as always, showing neither attachment nor rejection. She took it in a wagon, along with some suitcases, until she reached a distant village. She rented a simple house, and there rebuilt her days, hoping the pregnancy would go well. One morning, she noticed that Shadow had disappeared. She searched around, called, but the animal never appeared again. It was in this scenario that I was born months later, in the spring of 1996. My mother raised me alone, keeping the story of what had happened with Vince and the cat. She only told me bit by bit when she became ill and knew she didn't have much time. At first, I confess I doubted half of it, but I agreed to listen to the end because I saw how important it was for her to talk about it. In the end, she handed me some old belongings and asked that one day, if I wanted clarification, I should go to the old homestead. So shortly after turning 20, I decided to go. My mother had already departed this life, and I didn't feel peace without knowing the truth. I didn't really know the way, as she avoided mentioning place names. Even so, I gathered what I had and boarded a bus that left me at a dirt road stop in the autumn of 2016. I got off and realized there were few scattered houses, small shops, and an old shed. The heat was suffocating. I carried a bag and the old wooden box where my mother kept fabric clippings, notes, a torn photo, and some annotations. Everything I had concrete about her life before me. I walked along the dirt path, asking one person and another if they knew anyone from Vince's family, or if they knew of a house with large lands further ahead. Some residents looked at me with suspicion. Almost all denied knowing anything, but I persisted until they directed me to an elderly lady called Mrs. Zita, who lived in a simple house at the back of an almost abandoned site. I clapped my hands in front of the crooked gate. A weak voice told me to enter. I found Mrs. Zita sitting on a small wooden bench, messing with some tea leaves. I explained who I was said my mother's name was Sarah, and that she had been married to a man named Vince. The old woman frowned thoughtfully and answered slowly. I remember a very young girl, yes. There was a tragedy in that family, and I recall the young man who got sick and died too quickly. But we don't talk about that here. I asked about the cat, describing a dark, large feline. Upon hearing the mention of the cat, she changed her expression. Her eyes showed a certain fear. I've heard of a cat around these parts that came with outsiders and caused problems, but I don't know many details. People avoid touching on this subject. I thanked her and continued on. I managed to find what should be the old land that belonged to Vince. Much of it was overgrown with tall weeds and broken fences. In the center, you could see a ruined construction with part of the roof collapsed. I entered, pushing the rotten wooden door. Inside, everything was rubble. I imagined my mother moving through those rooms, so young and fragile. I picked up a piece of torn cloth from the floor, not knowing if it could have been hers. The feeling was heavy. I felt a lump in my throat, thinking about the suffering she experienced there. Suddenly, I heard a subtle noise coming from the dark hallway. My heart raced. I walked slowly, tense. To my relief or dismay, I saw no one. I just had the impression that something had moved in the darkness. It could be some wild animal or just a rat. I left there, and as soon as I set foot outside, I saw what I swear were two bright eyes between the branches of a dead tree. I blinked, trying to adjust my vision, and saw the silhouette of a large cat, completely dark. In an instant, it disappeared. I went after it but couldn't find it. I wondered if it was just my mind playing tricks. At night, I got simple lodging with a man named Roger, who rented rooms at the back of his house. The room was small, the bed was hard, and it had only one window with old Venetian blinds. As I tried to sleep, I kept turning over my mother's accounts in my mind. The image of the cat and the tree wouldn't leave my head. I woke up several times, startled, swearing I heard a distant meow. The clock always marked dead hours, like 3 in the morning or 4. I would get up, look through the window crack, and there was nothing beyond the wind blowing dust. The next day, I went to the local market. There I found a gentleman with kind features who sold herbs and roots. I asked if he knew any story of a cursed cat. He looked away and answered in a cautious tone. They say someone sometimes appears around here bringing a dark cat. I've seen people swear this animal causes strange diseases, but I prefer not to get involved. With each conversation, I found fragments that confirmed what my mother had told me, but no one wanted to give more details. It was then that I heard about a healer, Mr. Clayton, who lived around a wooden bridge. I took precarious transportation and went there in the late afternoon. His house was a rustic cabin surrounded by chickens and dogs. I knocked on the door. Yes, answered a gentleman with a firm voice, thin hair and deep gaze. I explained that I wanted to better understand the legend of a dark cat that supposedly caused misfortunes. I said I thought my family was a victim of this creature and mentioned Vince's name. Mr. Clayton invited me in, offered me a bitter tea, and listened to me attentively. I've heard many stories about this feline that seems to wander from place to place. No one knows for sure if it's really a cat or something else, he said, slowly stirring the cup. Cases of people getting sick after playing with the animal, others who began to have mysterious luck in games, but shortly afterward fell into disgrace. It's as if this cat trapped people in a silent pact, you know. A shiver ran through my body when he said that. I asked if there was any way to deal with this kind of influence. Mr. Clayton sighed. There are those who say that to free yourself, you need to refuse ownership of the cat, because the problem lies with who accepts it. It's as if the animal keeps transitioning until it finds someone who opens the doors to it, even without realizing it. I thanked him for the advice and returned to the lodging. From that day on, I began to suspect every shadow in the yards. At nightfall, I felt watched. The weather was dry. It hadn't rained for weeks. One dawn in the middle of October, I heard scratches at the door of the room. I got up, lit an old lamp, and approached. My heart was pounding hard. I opened just a crack and saw a yellow eye staring at me. I heard a deep meow that gave me chills. Then the creature ran into the darkness of the yard. In the following days, I began to have constant headaches, night sweats, and a strange weakness. I spent the afternoon with a heavy body, without disposition. I looked at my arms and noticed small reddish spots appearing. I tried to ignore them, but they increased and became darker, as if there was an internal bruise. Panic took over me. I was reproducing the first symptoms that my mother said had afflicted Vince. I thought to myself, is the cat's gaze doing something to me, or am I just influenced? Gradually, I realized that the fever and dizziness were getting worse, leaving me increasingly weak. Fearing the worst, I sought out Mr. Clayton again. He analyzed me, listening to my account of the cat at the door of the room. He said some low prayers, burned herbs that released a dense smoke, and asked me to spend the night in his cabin so he could try to take care of me with teas and herbal baths. I agreed without a better alternative. That night I hardly slept. My body ached, the fever rose, and I had the impression that brief images of a dark cat flooded my mind. Mr. Clayton would wake me up from time to time to give me a hot broth and pass a wet cloth on my forehead. Until around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a deep meow coming from outside. The cabin door shook slightly, as if some force was pushing it. Mr. Clayton got up quickly, grabbed a roll of dry leaves, and began to pray, making the sign of an amulet he wore around his neck. Don't open that door, Peter. Don't even move. If this cat wants to enter, it will try to attract you. It must feel that somehow you are vulnerable. I fought against fear and fever, huddling in the improvised bed. After a few minutes, maybe they were long seconds, I don't know, the noise ceased. No one dared to go out to verify. Only the next morning, when I opened the door, did I see claw marks tearing the wood at the height of a feline larger than normal. Mr. Clayton turned to me. If you don't want to end up like your father, you need to refuse this influence. Make it clear in some kind of confrontation that you don't accept the cat and that you won't be part of this. I was tired, feverish, but I agreed to try. I preferred to risk it than continue being haunted and potentially die there. He asked me to stay in the cabin for some more time, while he tried to strengthen me with herbs. He prepared poultices for the spots and made smudgings at sunset. After some days of rest, I felt a little better, even though I was still tormented by body aches and chills at nightfall. Then Mr. Clayton said it was time to try to break that bond. In the cabin's yard, he delimited a circle with stones. In the center, he lit a fire and made me sit there, saying, "Let's see if it appears. If it does, it's time to tell it everything you no longer want to carry." I waited there, listening to the croaking of frogs and the singing of insects. The wind blew strongly, and sometimes I had the sensation of seeing something moving beyond the clarity of the fire. It was then that in front of a bush, I noticed two luminous points. It was the cat. It watched motionless, as if studying each of our movements. Mr. Clayton closed his eyes and murmured prayers that I couldn't decipher. My skin burned in the dark spots exactly when the cat fixed its gaze on me. It advanced a few steps slowly and stopped near the circle of stones. My heart was beating so fast that I thought I would faint. Mr. Clayton nudged my shoulder. "Talk to it. Tell it you don't accept it in your life, that you don't want to continue what your father started." I gathered courage and, even with a trembling voice, shouted, "I won't follow this path. I don't want you with me. I won't fall into the same trap that took down my father." The cat raised its tail, gave a deep meow, and seemed to retreat. But it didn't run immediately. It stood staring, as if trying to evaluate the sincerity of what I was saying. I felt a lacerating pain in my arms where the spots throbbed. Mr. Clayton threw some herbs into the fire that released an acrid smell. The smoke rose in spirals, going in the direction of the cat. The feline jumped backward, reacting with a low hiss, and then disappeared into the darkness. I remained there, panting, in a cold sweat, not knowing if I had really gotten rid of that presence. It will look for another person, Peter. When it realizes there's no safe space, it moves on, said Mr. Clayton. We didn't destroy the creature, we just sent it away from you. The next morning, I woke up still weak, but I noticed that the spots on my arms were less inflamed. Mr. Clayton advised me to leave that place, because as long as I was so close to Vince's homestead, the cat's energy could return to haunt me. So I said goodbye to him, thanking him more than words could express. I gathered my belongings and took the road back to the central village, where I would catch the bus. On the journey, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief for believing I wouldn't have the same end as my father. Sadness for knowing my mother experienced so much pain there. I passed by Mrs. Zita's house to say goodbye. She looked at my arms and noticed the marks in the process of healing. She murmured something about the cat not always really going away, but wished me a good trip. I got on the bus, and as it moved away, I tried to convince myself that the chapter was closed. I wanted to leave behind the memory of Vince, his violence, and this feline entity that almost sucked my life away. I returned to the house where I had lived with my mother, now alone. The building seemed emptier than ever. I tidied the place, put away what remained of her things, and gradually resumed a more or less normal routine. Even so, from time to time, I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I had heard a distant meow. I would get out of bed, go to the window, and stay looking at the dark street. I never saw anything, but a chill persisted in running down my neck. Today, several years having passed, I no longer show symptoms. The wounds have healed, although some light spots still exist as scars. When people ask me what happened, I usually give vague answers. I have no desire to be seen as crazy or to spread rumors around. But in this account, I leave my warning. There are things that escape simple explanation. My mother survived as long as she could, but what she experienced marked her deeply. I myself almost succumbed to this same force that disguises itself as a dark cat. I don't know whether to call it a curse or just a shadow that feeds on the weakness of others. I know, however, that wherever it may be, shadow still wanders, waiting for someone to accept it in a moment of vulnerability. And whoever does so without realizing it may end up destroyed. I prefer to believe that by refusing this cycle, I saved my life from a cruel fate. I walk forward without forgetting where I came from, but also not holding myself to the past. I feel that every time I hear a deep meow in the silence of dawn, something in me trembles, the memory of that feline gaze that, at a certain moment, tried to take me completely. I hope no one else needs to experience this kind of terror. And if a stranger appears at your door with a gift, be careful. Before we move on to the next account, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive the next stories. Your presence is important, and your support is essential. Well, let's go. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.